A girl named Miss Marin recently appeared in the Duke's house, and the owner of this place decided to ask how she was living in the Duke's castle. Marin felt incredibly comfortable here and thanked the gentleman for the attention and care he showed her. It was wonderful here, a warm, cozy, soft bed that Marin had never slept on before, and delicious food. The most important thing was that this job paid her an incredibly high salary, and this could not but please her. The Duke's castle was truly magnificent, and Marin did not expect that such conditions could await her, as if she had found herself in a fairy tale. Hiding her admiration, she confessed that she really liked it here, and the gentleman in the black blindfold asked if this was true. Marin thought he just wanted to ask her about their living conditions, but suddenly the gentleman proposed to her, and it sounded quite serious. Marin even thought that perhaps she had misunderstood her words, and asked the Duke to repeat again what he had just said. She wasn't imagining things, and he really did propose to her right then and there, sitting by the warm fireplace. Not expecting such a proposal, Marin said that he probably really did have hearing problems, and that she probably needed to see a doctor. The Duke asked her to sit back down when she wanted to leave, and she had no right to disobey his will. Marin had only recently started living here, and the wedding proposal seemed like something of a shock. To get engaged to an ordinary commoner, what was the Duke even thinking about, and did he really just decide to tease her again? In a trembling voice, Marin said that the Duke was speaking especially strangely today, and even offered to read today's report aloud to him. Sitting opposite an ordinary girl, the richest Duke of the Empire asked her what she really wanted to get out of this life. He called her by her name, Lady Marin Schuvence, but all this time the commoner carefully tried to hide her true origin. The gentleman knew that she had hidden her connection to the noble family in order to enter the ducal castle and work, and was it not because she wanted to get something? Marin was sure that she carefully hid her origins. Unfortunately, the Duke already knew everything about her. After his words, she wanted to run away somewhere far away so that this conversation between them would not happen again. Now she was forced to stay here, talk about this topic, and honestly answer all the questions that the Duke would ask. The gentleman asked if she really thought she could deceive the Duchy of Vines so easily. Her deception was supposed to be just perfect, and she had no idea at what point everything went wrong and the end was definitely awaiting her. Now Marin lived in a small, dilapidated house in the middle of the mountains, but in an incredibly beautiful place. Some time ago, the girl lived with her mother, but their life could hardly be called happy. Every day she carefully brought food for her mother, but unfortunately the money was not enough for much. The mother was always worried about her daughter's condition, and she only wanted her to be happy one day. Today, Marin brought her mother delicious honey cookies and amazing soup for breakfast, but her mother was always upset about something, and even today she refused to eat. Every day she promised to eat, but she did not eat. Her strength gradually waned, she slept poorly, and she had no appetite at all. Marin understood that if her mother continued to skip meals every time, it was unlikely that she would survive this cold winter. To somehow bring her to her senses, her daughter suggested reading one of her favorite books that evening, because she often said that her daughter's voice helps her fall asleep. Indeed, when her daughter read to her, her soul felt truly light, and Marin was surprised why she hadn't thought of this before. There was a knock on the door. The daughter decided to check who had come. She left the soup near her mother and once again asked her to be sure to eat it. Opening the door, Maureen saw a pot-bellied little man standing on the threshold, and it was the hated Mayor Georges. The girl greeted the man sullenly. She hardly wanted to see him here, but she needed to know what brought him here. The man asked what the point of these formalities was, since they had been close for a long time, and Marin, not wanting to be near him, said that if he had nothing to say, then she would be better off returning to the house. Every meeting with this man promised something unpleasant, and he could hardly be called a positive hero. Giorgio was indignant starting this month. The rent had tripled, and Maureen didn't understand why there had been such a sudden change. He insisted that he had already raised everyone's rent a long time ago, but he had put it off until the very last minute for Marin. Unfortunately, the lady had nowhere to get such a large sum of money right now, and she had only one option left: ask this fool to wait a little longer. A cheeky grin appeared on the impudent man's face, and he understood that now he could simply take advantage of this moment. He reached out to her and whispered, "There is another way, and that doesn't mean there are no other options for paying." Frightened, Marin closed the door right in his face as soon as his dirty fingers approached her clothes. Only loud screams were heard behind the door. He called the lady a dried-up roach, promising that if she didn't prepare the money before his next visit, he would throw her and her mother out into the street. Winter was coming soon, and Marin couldn't allow herself and her sick mother to be thrown out like that, left without a roof over their heads. The heroine needed to get a very large sum of money somewhere, and do it as quickly as possible. And she thought they now had no other choice but to use the one option that was left for the most extreme case. There was something in this empire that only Marin could do, and she got her hands on a novel called The Western Duke's Bluebird Does Not Sing. The lady had read many novels about the Northern Duke, but she chose this book simply because the title Western Duke seemed refreshing to her. To think that she had been transported into this world and had been living here all this time was simply ridiculous. After the car accident, when Marin finally woke up, having been between life and death for more than a month, she realized that the place where she now lives is the world of a novel. She had many tasks to complete, but unfortunately she was not the main character, but ended up here, together with the Western Duke. The plot of the book, The Bluebird of the Western Duke Does Not Sing, is quite simple. The novel is incredibly fascinating, but also holds many secrets. The male protagonist, a Western Duke, once went blind and gradually died after being attacked by a monster, but he met the heroine, a medical genius, who could heal his sight. After that, the heroes fell in love with each other, and everything was exactly like in a fantasy novel. Marin was just a character who never appeared in the novel, a simple supporting girl and nothing more. Her main task was to stay away from the venerable gentleman so that the Duke could finally get his happy ending. Now she needed to find money, very urgently, and this was the only way to simply survive. Viscount Chauvinet's family once became incredibly rich, and for a long time they lived in luxury and prosperity. After a carriage accident, her father and only brother died, and at the same time, the huge debts left by her father were revealed. Marin did not even have the opportunity to be embarrassed by the realization of her rebirth. The family fell apart, and financial difficulties fell upon them. After selling everything they had, the only thing left was an antique vanity table her father had given her. With her family destroyed, Maureen never even had a debut. Her title as a Viscount's daughter was useless, and she was still scraping by on what she knew about the novel's plot. The moment had come when the heroine had reached her limit, and it was necessary to act as quickly as possible. With the abilities she carried over from her previous life and information that only she knew in this world, now Marin will have to use her main weapon, the knowledge with which she can earn money. The next day, she immediately went to the ducal castle, where a new life was supposed to await her. Mrs. Marin put on her best dress from her past life and came to an interview looking for a job. The young man who met her noted that the resume was written in a very neat handwriting, and it was unlikely that an ordinary commoner could write like that. Marin thanked the gentleman for the compliment, and all this was only thanks to her past life. Now she really was living in a novel, unfortunately. Nothing connected her with her past life anymore. Today she met that same Oliver Leon, who admitted that it is rare to meet a woman who can read and write, and this is unusual. Marin, for her part, was meeting the novel's key character for the first time, and he was the Duke's assistant, and she was incredibly nervous. She made up a story that she learned to read and write in the Count's house at her previous job. He taught her everything, and the lady even had several books that she reread over and over again. The new books were too expensive to buy, and Marin had to make it look plausible, but it might look suspicious. Most daughters of aristocrats do not learn to read and write instead. They try to develop manners and taste by playing musical instruments. Aristocrats contemplated works of art, but in a lady's past life, reading was her favorite hobby. She asked her father to teach her to read and write, after which she spent her days reading alone at home, while away her evenings with interesting books. Reading also interrupted her communication with the few young ladies she knew, but the time spent with books was precious and happy to her. Oliver said that he was indeed looking for someone to help him, but he was specifically looking for a male assistant. He had been told that a young man named Marion would be coming by recommendation, and he eagerly awaited his arrival. So now Oliver was a little confused when he saw a girl in front of him, but who on the other hand had many skills. Marin was upset that she no longer had a choice, otherwise she would not have even set foot in the door, let alone met the Duke. Perhaps she should have even dressed up as a man, but the Duke would hardly have fallen for such a trick and would have immediately realized that she was a woman. Therefore, the lady had no choice but to go in her true form, and she stated that Marion was her elder brother. He had left for the capital, and she did not want to miss such a wonderful opportunity to work in the duchy. There were already enough maids in the castle, and hiring maids was the prerogative of the head maid, and Oliver had nothing to do with it. Marion understood that she would be rejected, but she no longer had any other choice. Therefore, the lady pulled herself together and admitted that her help would definitely be needed in this place, and asked Oliver to think again. Oliver wondered if he would really need help, knowing that the lady really wanted to get this job. Therefore, without hesitation, she said that help would be needed specifically by His Grace the Duke, and Oliver took her words with some caution. He asked what the lady meant when she offered her help specifically to the owner of this house. There was no one in these western lands who did not know about the unfortunate incident that had happened to the Duke. Marion may have crossed all boundaries, and Oliver sternly asked if she understood what she was talking about, asking her to leave. This was her last chance, and Marion could not just leave this place, realizing that only here she could find work. Suddenly, she saw a book on the coffee table, and with its help, she could demonstrate her abilities right now. Without thinking, the lady decided to take it, and she didn't even care at all what Oliver might think of her. Oliver certainly didn't expect such confidence until Marion had already picked up the book and started reading something. Wondering what the girl was doing, he heard her velvety voice as she began to read the first lines of the book. Oliver stood as if spellbound, and he had never seen a lady read before, but this was no ordinary reading. It was a book about monsters, which said that many scientists have raised this question, but no one has ever found an answer as to why this might be. The lady read that scientists have become fascinated with a theory that cannot even be proven, and it states that the ecology of monsters changes, adapting to the environment. She continued reading about how the historian Count, who called this theory the greatest sense of whos, claimed the opposite. Most scientists disagreed with this. After reading a couple of paragraphs, she looked at Oliver, who stood in front of her perplexed, and asked if she should continue. His lordship cannot look through documents, that is, when it is inconvenient for him to read, she could easily cope with this task. The blind duke often has to absorb information from our bow, and this is where the heroine wanted to show off her abilities due to her past life as a voice actress. Marion confidently stated, holding the book in her hands, that it would be useful to his lordship Gurk. This is exactly what she wanted to convey to Oliver. After reading, the young man asked her to sit down first, and probably the heroine had at least the slightest chance. She still held the book in her hands, so she could talk Oliver into hiring her. The young man stated that he hardly had the authority to hire her. If it were simply a matter of finding an assistant, he would be able to decide it himself. Reading documents to His Grace, the Duke was a different matter entirely, and after his words, Marion sighed heavily. She didn't know what to do, and would she really have to leave without meeting the Duke? The main question remained rent and medicine for her mother. However, Oliver noted that she read very well. It was the first time he had seen a special talent, and to be honest, they had a lot of problems reading documents. And finally he realized that it seemed that Mrs. Marion could easily solve this problem. Clutching the book to her heart, Marion asked in a joyful voice what Oliver meant, and smiling joyfully, the young man suggested going straight to his lordship to tell him everything. They walked along the dark corridor of the huge, majestic castle, and Marion only prayed that everything would work out for her. It was getting darker and darker ahead. She could hardly see anything, and it was no accident that it was so dark here. For a moment the lady felt as if she were in the blackest cave, in a thick darkness that envelops you completely. Oliver said that his lordship is very sensitive to light, so the council allowed it to be turned on only in certain rooms. And if she was going to serve the Duke, he was ready to tell her about many things that should be paid attention to. The Duke's office was pitch dark, almost nothing could be seen, and the gentleman sat behind a huge oak table. He already realized from afar that someone was approaching his office, and someone else was walking with Oliver. He allowed the assistant to enter, and Marion followed him without making a sound. She looked at the respectable gentleman with a black blindfold, and this man was the main character of the novel, a novel called The Blue Bird of the Western Duke Does Not Cry, which she had read in a past life and admired every line. Blind Duke Gerald, a black bandage hid his eyes, depriving his face of its usual expressiveness, but giving it something mysterious and attractive. Oliver said that he wanted to hire a man, and it seemed to be a matter that required his lordship's permission, so he came to him. Gerald was indignant, since when did he have to get involved in every issue related to the servants? The thing was, the maid was quite special, and Oliver thought it would be good to have her around to help. Gerald replied that he had already met all the doctors in the Empire, but Oliver admitted that this girl was not a doctor at all. Gerald did not understand how she could be of use to him, and Oliver asked the lady to act as she had done in the drawing room. Maren picked up a sheet of paper and prepared to start reading, although her hands were shaking at that moment. She knew she could do it without any problems, but now she simply had to show herself. The lady began reading an urgent report about a silver mine discovered in Nairon's domain, and the Duke actually took notice. The document contained something about the results of the annual research and analytical work, as well as the area of the appearance of underground monsters in the tunnels. The young men listened attentively to her reading, and it seemed as if her voice filled the entire room at that time. The report stated that mining experts believed it would be better to close the mine and ordered an immediate closure. This content was an exact story from the original. The silver mine is quite an important theme in the middle of the novel, and the main character came here to collect herbs and accidentally picked up some mineral. She processed it and made a necklace, and the whole of high society was completely enchanted by this unusual stone. The mine was not silver, it was a new gemstone deposit, and the name of the stone was opal, the first stone discovered with that single shimmer and iridescent sparkle, the price of which skyrocketed. For some reason, the heroine didn't immediately remember this. If she had secretly dug up a little, she would have become rich in an instant. She even said the word sorry out loud, and the Duke was already standing right in front of her and asked what she was sorry about. Maren didn't even notice when he managed to get so close to her, and she shuddered in surprise. Gerald asked her again what she regretted, and even though he was blind, it was as if he was looking straight at her. Feeling his incredibly strong and powerful aura, Maren became even more worried and even a little scared. She was so taken aback that she couldn't stand on her feet, and literally a second later she was ready to fall right in the castle owner's office. She had no chance of not falling down right in front of him. She understood that now she would look very stupid. The Duke managed to grab her hand, literally in 1 second, during which she almost collapsed. With his other hand, he grabbed her by the shoulders, and it was such a mysterious moment that Maren seemed to find herself in another world. Thanking the Duke for saving her, she gazed intently at his charming features. It was as if she couldn't tear herself away from him. His graceful, neat features attracted attention, and the black bandage created a magical aura. As befits a protagonist, Maren saw that the Duke was simply incredibly handsome up close. Now was not the time to admire his beautiful features. For some reason, he was still holding her hand, and it seemed he was not at all ready to let go. Gerald turned to Oliver and asked if he usually had enough patience to put up with something like this. At this moment, the heroine became frightened and began to say something about the monsters she had just read about in the report. It took the attention off Gerald a bit, and he didn't understand why she had decided to talk about monsters right now. The lady admitted that she knows that tunnel monsters love minerals that are shiny and like precious stones. If monsters appear frequently, then even if it's not silver, there might be other gems there, and that's how she managed to get out. The Duke asked the name of this brave commoner who was so desperate to get this job. Looking at her wrist, the lady waited for him to let go of her hand, but it was surprising that the commoner could read and even analyze reports. Unexpectedly, Gerald called her a spy, and the heroine did not expect such a turn of events at all. It seemed that the young man was serious in his words. There was not a drop of doubt on his face. He let go of her hand, her wrist was enveloped in a slight pain, and the gentleman asked Oliver to draw up a temporary employment contract for now. Surprisingly, the Duke agreed to check on Maren, and at that moment a happy smile appeared on the girl's face. She bowed before the Duke as he decided to give another order to his assistant. And suddenly he asked to feed Maren, and even Oliver did not expect to hear this. He asked to do this for a reason, saying that the lady's wrist was like a fragile twig that could easily be broken. The Duke had large, manly hands, so Maren's wrist was naturally fragile in comparison. After the unexpected meeting, the Duke was left alone in his office, and for the first time he felt something. She seemed strange to him. Her voice did not irritate him at all, because usually everything was the other way around. Gerald couldn't even remember the last time he had listened to a report and actually thought about it, and now he understood why Oliver had asked so persistently. The Duke's House of Vines, which protects the western lands, has a family secret that was passed down only to the direct heir by seniority. Eyes that can distinguish the color of the eyes of flying birds, ears that can distinguish all sounds within a radius of 50 meters, a tongue and nose that can distinguish all smells and tastes, and skin that does not miss the slightest touch. All senses were beyond human capabilities, and Gerald von Vines possessed the most outstanding of all the dukes. The Great House of Vines, the Defenders of the Vines, is a formula that has never been broken, made even more famous by the current Duke. A year ago, a monster attack deprived the Duke of his sight, everything turned upside down, and as if trying to compensate for the lost vision, his other senses became even more acute. With all his senses out of control, his mind began to weaken, especially his hearing, and even the sound of a crawling insect struck his head like thunder. Today, for the first time, a strange voice did not cause him pain, and he even found it pleasant. It is therefore not surprising that Gerald paid attention to this girl, feeling her with his soul. He understood perfectly well that she was afraid of him, but she still lied, because her heart was beating so fast. That was the tension. She still told a lie, and there must be a good reason why she decided to take such a desperate step. The gentleman called in an assistant named Kay, who handled special assignments. He ordered to find out about this girl, all the details of her life, as well as her origin. Kay carried out the most mysterious orders of the master. His main task was to remain unnoticed and reveal secrets. After the reception, Oliver prepared an employment contract. The salary was stated as 1 gold piece per week, and this was the living expenses for the whole month. That's why they say you have to become a servant to a rich master, and even though it was a contract position, Maren had a high salary, since she was supposed to become a specialist in a special field. In the original work, there were such people who worked in high positions. A spy who infiltrated the eastern lands, the shadow of a duke named Kay, whose identity no one knew. A blacksmith of the ducal house named Surin, and even an alchemist named Zero, and all these people were the closest to the venerable gentleman. If Maren became a full-time employee, her salary would increase, and the lady's eyes were dazzled, so she had to try her best to get a position. Without thinking, she signed the documents, and Oliver first asked her not to rush and check everything carefully. That was not all. Maren said that she loved to read, and Oliver had a special gift for her. There was a book on the table that belonged to the ducal library, and for some reason Oliver decided to give it to Maren. Looking at the title, the lady realized that this was the same book that she had already read once. The cover was expensive, the book looked valuable, and the lady even asked again if it was really possible to take it. Oliver was going to throw it away anyway, and Maren, clutching the book to her chest with special gratitude, admired such a gift. Thanks to her, she passed the interview, and now she also received it as a gift, and it was a real book of luck. After successfully getting the job, Maren returned to her mother, who waited for her until late at night. She was very late, so she decided to immediately clean up and read a book to her mother, but today she brought something else with her. Looking at the full plate, the daughter was upset. The mother again skipped lunch and did not eat anything all day. Maren held a large basket in her hands, covered with a white cloth, and her daughter happily asked her mother to look at what was inside. The basket contained delicious aromatic food, bread, sweets, meat, milk, everything that had not been in their house for a long time. The mother looked at her daughter in surprise, not understanding what all this meant and where she got such products. She began to worry that her daughter had borrowed money from someone again for her sake, but Maren admitted that this was not the case at all. She told me that she had taken a job in the ducal house, and my mother immediately realized that she was talking about the famous Vines family. The daughter confessed that this was the same western house of the Duke that protected them, and as a welcoming gift, they gave a basket of food. Without holding back her tears, the mother understood that the ducal family could be trusted, because this was the same famous Duke. How much time had passed since her daughter had seen her so happy, and after the accident she even stopped praying. Maren said she lied to his lordship, saying that she was an ordinary commoner, and that was the only way she had to get a job. If she had told the truth about her noble origins, there would have been no chance of an interview, and young ladies with impure intentions are constantly trying to get close to his lordship. That's why they said that before meeting the main character, he hadn't dated anyone, but after seeing his appearance, Maren realized how much he must have been bothered. It's understandable why he shied away from women, and Maren had previously thought that the image of a protagonist who never dated anyone was too much. As soon as she decided to collect a certain amount, she wanted to quit immediately, and her mother could not contradict her daughter's will. She believed in her little Marin, who tried with all her might to make their life better. When the Duke meets the main character, he will see the light, and naturally, he will no longer need Marin, and she did not want to get involved in the events of the original and get caught in the crossfire. And the first thing she wanted to do, when she had collected the necessary amount, was move to a bigger house, start a vegetable garden, and plant the flowers that her mother loved. She didn't even have to become a full-time employee, and Marin was confident she only needed to last exactly 6 months. The next day, when she arrived at her new job, Oliver, for some reason, suddenly asked her to leave. His answer was polite, and he assured her that it would be better for the girl to go home today, and even tomorrow, and the day after. Marin didn't understand what was going on, because just yesterday she had been hired. Even the Duke himself had agreed. The girl asked if she had been fired, but that definitely couldn't have happened. She wasn't ready to leave after going through all the difficulties to get here, and how could she be kicked out after just one day? Oliver assured her and tried to calm her down, and that was not the point at all, but Marin wanted to hear the truth. While she was trying to figure something out, a gentleman's voice was heard behind the door, addressing the two of them. Marin had already fallen to her knees in front of Oliver, but the Duke asked the two of them to enter the office right now. She didn't know his lordship was inside, and she regretted making a noise right outside his doors. The Duke stood as if nothing had happened near his desk and silently greeted his assistants. As soon as Marin crossed the threshold of the office, she smelled a strange smell that could not be confused with anything else. There was a faint scent of blood, and she was immediately reminded of that incident with the carriage, which would forever remain in her memory. The neighing of horses, drops of blood falling right before her eyes, the lady tried her best to pull herself together so as not to get upset. She definitely couldn't faint here and now, so she clutched the hem of her dress tightly to hide her excitement. Gerald asked a strange question. If the lady wants to die, then she can die right here and now. The lady began to deny that she had meant it that way, and Oliver even asked the gentleman for forgiveness. He couldn't tell her about his condition, so he just wanted to send her away, but it seemed Lady Marin mistakenly thought she was being fired. That was exactly the point, and now Marin regretted even more that she had caused such a fuss. She apologized to the Duke and bowed her head low, asking for forgiveness, and in fact she knew nothing. Gerald exhaled silently, and on the one hand the girl could be understood. Oliver wanted her not to see Gerald's condition, but the Duke suggested that she start working. So that smell of blood was because his lordship was wounded, and Gerald asked him to stop chatting, provide a report, and leave the office. The servant obediently handed the important papers to the lady, warning her where she should begin reading. Marin was ready to begin with a trembling voice, but her whole body was shaking and trembling with fear. The Duke asked if she would really read the report right next to the entrance, but she really felt more comfortable there, and being nearby was too exciting. He seemed not to notice her words, and the next second he was already approaching. Taking her hand again, he stood next to her, and Marin felt his heavy breathing and close presence. Gerald wanted her to come closer, but his request made her heart beat even faster. Just like last time, they stood opposite each other, and Marin didn't understand why he was doing this. The closer he came, the further she moved away, and she was no longer able to stand next to him. She was not allowed to make noise, and Marin understood this perfectly well, but she could not contain her strong emotions. Gerald felt that the girl was very nervous and decided to ask the temporary employee directly why she was behaving this way. Marin could no longer move at all. She felt like a stone statue, ready to carry out his orders. Gerald asked why she deliberately held back the scream that was about to burst out. Marin admitted that she held back a scream because a loud voice was incredibly irritating to the gentleman. He asked if screaming in fear wasn't a natural reaction, and it certainly was. It was necessary to answer carefully, the lady thought. Since His Excellency had problems with his eyesight, she should do so. She guessed that the Duke must be very sensitive to sounds, and bowing low, she asked his forgiveness. She tried not to look at Gerald, and he kept trying to solve the riddles of this unusual lady. A temporary worker was unlikely to know the secrets of the Vines family, but she came to this conclusion in just a split second. The gentleman appreciated her good analytical skills, and this time she was really just lucky. The heavy scarlet velvet curtains were always closed, but today a small gap appeared there. Light began to break through the dark curtains, illuminating the manly silhouette of the gentleman. She looked up and noticed that His Excellency had something strange on his ear. It was definitely blood-scarlet stains that could not be confused with anything else were visible through the black mask. Marin was a little scared, but she plucked up her courage and decided to ask what was happening to him. The lady noticed that blood was coming from his ear, and could he really have been injured there? And if the smell of blood was so strong, then how serious was his injury? The Duke replied that it was just a trifle, and Marin should better not pay attention to it. The lady insisted that the wound needed to be treated quickly, but this was definitely not how it should be, and the wound could not heal on its own in a day. She remembered Oliver's words. The Duke must not take his wounds lightly, and he needed to find out why there was blood. Gerald insisted that he already knew the reason, so it didn't matter to him. He recently pierced his ear and told a new employee about it, who had never seen anything like it before. She asked who could have done this and expected the Duke to be sincere with her. He admitted that he had inflicted the wound on himself, but it was impossible to believe. Gerald pierced his own ear, and did he do it because the sounds were too painful and unbearable? Even a tiny cut on a finger from a knife hurts terribly, and the ear was the most delicate organ. And how unbearable it was for him that he went to such lengths, deciding to injure himself. All this time, the heroine was incredibly wrong, and Duke Gerald, like her mother, was not just a character. The gentleman was a living person, capable of feeling pain, but for some reason she had previously treated his suffering frivolously, and now the lady felt ashamed before. She had perceived his pain simply as information from an exciting novel. How terrifying and creepy it must have been for him when he suddenly went blind and was no longer the same person he had been. Tears appeared in her eyes, and the gentleman immediately felt everything, her excitement and worries. The young man asked why she was crying after hearing the information about the injury. At that moment, Oliver entered the office, holding important reports in his hands, and greeted Lady Marine. The reports needed urgent verification, and the lady was here just in time. Oliver asked Marin to take care of important papers that needed to be urgently reported to the gentleman. Marin prepared to read the text with all due responsibility, thanking the assistant. And above all, now she needed to focus on important work in order to prove herself to be the best employee. In a gentle voice, she read the entire document, drawing attention to the most important details with a unique intonation. When the report was finished, the lady suggested meeting during the next report, but the gentleman needed to rest. Just as she was about to leave, Gerald grabbed her fragile wrist again, preventing her from leaving the office. Still, he considered her wrists as fragile as a twig, and for some reason this question worried him greatly. The lady said that comparing a person's wrists to a branch, in her opinion, was too much, and he asked her to gain weight so that it would become bigger than it was now. And after she manages to gain a couple of kilograms, she should come to him for a checkup. His words sounded incredibly strange, and the heroine still couldn't believe that he was forcing her to eat so that she would gain a little weight. Not understanding why he was asking her about this, Marin was about to leave the office, and even the assistant's assistant did not deal with such matters. For some time after she left the office, the gentleman wondered what sensations he was experiencing. He found her incredibly strange, and Geralda wanted to find out who she really was as soon as possible. He was sure she was afraid of him, but at the same time she cried because of his injury, not hiding her sincerity. He felt her emotions, her experiences, and a person with a hard heart will definitely not cry when he hears about the pain of another. Kay has already prepared an investigation, and according to it, the real identity of Lady Marin Schwentz is the Viscount's daughter. He now knew that after the death of the head of the family and the eldest son in a carriage accident, she was ruined. She lived in a dilapidated hut, caring for her sick mother, and she had neither a husband nor a devotee. A woman who has no secrets, nothing special, but for some reason she was not afraid to approach him. The Duke thought it was impossible to predict what she would do, and unpredictable changes were too dangerous for him. Or, on the contrary, it is simply a game in which he is ready to take part, knowing that the price of defeat may be too high. In any case, he was determined to unravel her mystery, no matter the cost. The flames danced, casting strange shadows on the walls of the office, as if echoing the confusion in his soul. Oliver led the girl into her new office, which was incredibly spacious and looked very elegant. Besides the time of His Grace's report to the Duke, she needed to help Oliver with his work here, and she should be able to handle these tasks with ease. The desk was truly luxurious, and the thought of using new furniture after a long time made her heart pound. She decided to ask if it was really okay to leave his lordship's wound as is, but Oliver had also been worried about it for a long time. He would like to receive treatment, but his lordship really doesn't like it when something touches his body. But Marin understood that the wound could become inflamed. Besides, he sleeps poorly, recovery will be slow, and the lady had no idea that he could not sleep peacefully. There was nothing in the novel about the Duke's sleep disturbances, and perhaps the eyes made the sensations more acute. Marin understood that if he used something, his vision could return, and then everything would get better in the Duke's life. It was the main character's job to help the main character she had to restore his vision, and Marin shouldn't interfere unnecessarily. She offered Oliver to serve the gentleman some warm wine, and her mother always drank it when she couldn't sleep. Oliver had never heard anything like it, that a warm alcoholic drink could actually help you relax and sleep peacefully. Marin decided to remind Oliver to address her informally, since she was an ordinary commoner. In turn, the gentleman suggested calling him by his first name, and a warm, pleasant relationship immediately developed between them. Oliver brought in an incredibly large stack of papers and declared that in that case it was time to get to work. And now I'll have to put off having a good boss for later, because Marin had never seen such a pile of paperwork in her life that needed to be sorted through. She worked diligently until late at night, until her hands were numb from writing and her head stopped thinking altogether. The lady was not distracted for a second, and caring Oliver presented the lady with delicious sweet treats, realizing that she was probably hungry. He even warned her that if she didn't have enough food, she could just say so openly and not embarrass anyone. At that moment, the heroine remembered his lordship's order to fatten up Miss Marine, and he clearly made it clear that she should eat as much as possible. She even thought that if she ate it all at once, she might feel sick, and she bit off a piece of the tasty treat. The taste she felt was simply incredible, as if a fragrant sweetness was spreading throughout her mouth. She remembered her mother and asked Oliver to take some cake with him, since he had already shared food last time, and she asked him to do it again. Oliver agreed and warned that he would definitely report to the kitchen and that they would pack a sweet treat with them. A man's cough suddenly came from the office, and the lady saw a tall man with a gray beard, elegant, wearing white gloves. It was the head butler, whom the heroine had never seen before, and Oliver asked him to come in. The tall gentleman in the black tailcoat had worked here as a butler for a long time, and his name was Mr. Sebastian. It would seem that the elegant man should be too strict, but his face was lit up with warm feelings. The butler's grandson had recently gotten married and was supposed to be at the wedding, and Oliver asked if everything had gone well. They say that he, like Oliver, was an ardent admirer of the Duke, and the former second-in-command of the Knight's detachment, Butler Sebastian. Sebastian was brought here by something. He wanted to ask if he could personally express his gratitude to His Grace the Duke. Oliver admitted that it was unlikely to happen today, and Sebastian should wait a little longer until the right moment. A little upset, the gentleman understood the state of his master, which was impossible to predict. Even the butler could not see his lordship without Oliver's permission, although he occupied a high position here. Late with the introduction, Oliver turned to Marin, calling her his new assistant, and the lady was incredibly pleased to meet him. Oliver explained that the lady had become a special employee who reports to the Duke, and introduced the butler to the lady. Sebastian smiled and bowed politely, and in turn he was also very pleased to meet the nice girl. Oliver did not hide the fact that Miss Marin's reporting skills were so excellent that even the Duke was pleased, and Sebastian was incredibly surprised. An awkward smile appeared on the heroine's face. Oliver had just praised her, and the Duke himself was listening to Miss Marin's report with great pleasure. The butler took her hand, and if even the Duke recognized her, it was truly impressive, and if the lady needed anything small in the future, she could always turn to him. He joyfully shook her hands, and Marin felt a very good, favorable energy from him. She had to be careful not to let the lie get out, and the thought of how the Duke's admirers would react if they found out scared her. The moon illuminated the spires of the ducal castle, weaving every stone, every jagged projection like silver lace. It was late at night that Mr. Gerald could hardly fall asleep. He had not slept for a long time, and this state probably exhausted him even more. Oliver came into the office to check on his condition, and was again surprised to see the Duke at his desk. The assistant admitted that today the gentleman definitely needed to sleep, since several days had already passed without sleep, and this could affect his health. On Marin's advice, he brought warm wine. The gentleman immediately smelled the aroma of the alcoholic drink and asked if Oliver really thought it would help him fall asleep. The assistant did not hide the fact that he decided to take warm wine on the recommendation of Lady Marin, and the Duke was a little surprised. Pouring a warm drink into a glass, Oliver reported that Lady Marin had told him that her mother drank wine when she couldn't sleep. The lady had already left her workplace a long time ago, as it was quite late, but she diligently reviewed all the documents. Inhaling the aroma of warm wine, the gentleman held a glass in his hands and looked a little puzzled. Oliver reported that as for Miss Marin, she can read, her mother drank wine, and that is a little strange. Even the way she holds her cup of tea speaks of her noble origin, and the assistant managed to notice that it seemed she was not a commoner at all. The Duke had already managed to find out that this girl was the daughter of an impoverished baron who had once died tragically. Oliver suggested that perhaps her goal was money, and her situation must be truly desperate, since she even falsified her resume. She was a woman everyone liked, and the Duke was haunted by the thought that she possessed genuine skills as a spy. Taking a small sip of warm wine, the gentleman felt relaxed. He hadn't drunk for a long time, and it turned out not to be so bad. A satisfied Marin was once again carrying a heavy basket of delicious aromatic food in her hands. She was sure that her mother would definitely like it. This time the cooks in the kitchen carefully wrapped up treats for her, and it was good that she talked to Oliver about this topic. There was one piece of good news: her mother had even regained her appetite recently, and at times like these it was necessary to feed her hearty and nutritious food. A happy Marin approached her home, dreaming of how she would earn even more money thanks to her skills. As soon as she approached the old hut, she noticed that the door to the house was wide open, although her mother always carefully closed it. Marin felt something strange, frightening, and the heavy basket even fell out of her hands straight onto the ground. She ran headlong into the hut to check if everything was okay with her mother, but she saw real devastation inside. All the things were scattered around. It was unclear what was happening here, but one thing was clear: something terrible had happened here. She heard her mother's voice in the distance coming from her room, and she desperately called her daughter for help. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest, sensing something bad. She rushed into her mother's room in fear, just so that everything would be okay with her. Fear gripped her with icy embraces. She remembered rumors about bandits prowling the area, about missing peasants. Mother sat on the floor, her hair disheveled, and she desperately clung to the only precious thing, the very chest of drawers that remained from her past life. Mother's voice trembled. She began to tell that the owner's wife had recently come to the house, and it was she who had arranged all this. The terrible woman mistook Marin for her husband's mistress, and having burst into their house, smashed everything around. She said all sorts of nonsense, started smashing and throwing things around in a rage, and also warned that if she didn't get the rent by tomorrow, they should get out. The mother asked Marin for forgiveness, but her daughter tried to calm her down and assured her that she was not to blame for anything. Unfortunately, she was unable to save anything except this dressing table, which was left over from a luxurious life and their father as a memory. Marin was worried that all the blame lay on her, because her mother was really not guilty of anything. She felt that she could have done something sooner and should have dealt with the owner's advances immediately. They should have just ignored them. The lady had only one option left. She was currently working in the Duke's house and could find help there. She confidently stated that she would go to him right now to ask him to punish the people who dared to treat her like that. It was almost late at night. Marin finally appeared on the threshold of the Duke's mansion, but she was worried that no one would let her in now. The guards immediately approached, asking who she was and what she was doing there at such a late hour. The lady gave her name and said that she worked under Mr. Oliver, and she urgently needed to see him right now. The knights were surprised that the girl was working under the master assistant, but they saw her for the first time. He turned to his partner, asking if he knew this woman who claimed to work for Oliver himself. The young man looked at the girl carefully, assessing her with his gaze, but unfortunately did not recognize her. They really saw her for the first time, but for some reason they had never met before, and the assistant even admitted that he didn't know her. The conversation between the knights was very funny. They tried to find out from each other if anyone knew anything, but it was all in vain. At this point, one of the assistants decided to run away from his partner, declaring that he definitely did not want to take part in this. The knight turned to the lady and asked for forgiveness. His companion was still too young, and he decided to first check everything himself and then give the lady an answer. All this time, Madame Marin had been waiting in the living room, and she really wanted Oliver and the butler to come to her. Fortunately, the butler confirmed her identity, and he immediately asked if she had managed to meet Mr. Oliver. Surprised by the unexpected appearance, Oliver came to the girl to ask if something urgent had happened. Maren was excited, it was impossible not to notice, and she knew she had to tell the whole truth. Even though she had only worked there for one day, she decided to ask for a week's advance. The lady confessed that the landlord had warned her that if she didn't pay the rent by tomorrow, she would have to move out immediately, and her mother was ill, and she couldn't live in poor conditions. She was ready to burst into tears right in front of Oliver, but the young man only asked the lady to calm down and raise her head. He was ready to help her right now, but the decision about her salary was made only by the Duke and no one else. Therefore, to begin with, he suggested reporting this to Mr. Gerald so that he would be aware of everything that was happening. Standing outside the Duke's office, Oliver admitted that he had an urgent report regarding Lady Maren. Gerald asked him to come in, and when something was very important, he always felt it. For some reason, Oliver asked her to hold the candle, and she was surprised, because before he had always entered the office first. Now the Duke had called only her, and this meant that Oliver was not allowed to go with her. Maren had never heard anyone call her name, and this was the first time that the Duke had decided to talk to her personally, without the presence of an assistant. She came in with apologies for disturbing the gentleman in the middle of the night, and was very sorry about it. Gerald asked what was wrong, since she decided to come so late after several days of work. The lady felt very awkward, but she pulled herself together and asked if she could get her salary in advance a week earlier. Gerald remained silent for now and did not answer her question, as if he was trying to assess the situation and understand whether she was telling the truth or not. The gentleman asked why he should fulfill this request, since Maren had only worked there for one day, and if he does give her an advance, what will she as a temporary worker do for him? Maren's eyes widened, and she didn't understand what to say or how, without a penny in her pocket, she could do anything for the Duke. Her gaze fell on the glass of red wine, and that was definitely it. And at that moment, the heroine remembered how recently she had advised Oliver to try this method. When Oliver told her that the Duke could not sleep and that his recovery was slow, it was she who advised him to drink warm wine. Therefore, without hesitation, the lady confidently declared that she would put the gentleman to bed, and this would be the best help for him. Maren not only understood reports well, but also read books well. Her mother said that when she read aloud to her, she fell asleep beautifully. The Duke asked in surprise how she knew that he had not been able to sleep for a long time, and whether his assistant had really blabbed everything. Trying to somehow protect him, the lady admitted that Mr. Oliver said this without a word of intent, and he was really worried about him. Surprisingly, the Duke agreed very quickly, and Maren didn't even have to persuade him for long. A slight smile even seemed to appear on his face, and he confidently replied that he was ready to accept her help. And now Maren only had to do the most important thing, put the Duke to bed to help her sick mother, and not be left without a roof over her head. Perhaps it all sounded and looked too strange, but she had no other choice but to use her talent. The gentleman asked how long it took to get from the castle to the house, and the journey to her hut took about an hour. It was a long distance, and Gerald warned Oliver that Maren would probably have to move to his castle. Maren didn't yet understand what was happening, but she definitely heard that the Duke wanted her to live here. Gerald ordered that the temporary housing be moved to the outbuilding, and if the lady had a family, that everything be arranged so that they could live together. This meant that Maren could now live in the ducal castle with her mother, and the master ordered that an advance be paid now, and not only the issue of money, but also housing was resolved in an instant. She couldn't even imagine how to thank the gentleman who decided to shelter her in his mansion. The lady smiled tenderly and thanked Gerald with all her heart, not expecting that such a thing could be expected at all. Oliver invited the lady to go back to the office to discuss the details and particulars of the move. Now everything was turning out in a completely strange way, but all of Gerald's decisions were well thought out. Reading books to fall asleep, and now Marina was going to play the role of a nanny, and the gentleman was perplexed as to what her little head was thinking about. And since she would now live in his castle, the master was confident that he would soon be able to find out everything and reveal her secrets. Oliver provided the girl with the best horse. Maren was incredibly fond of animals, and she stroked his muzzle with care and affection. She thanked the good horse for taking her there without any problems or incidents, and the journey did not take too long. The mother came out to meet her daughter, worried about her, and Maren told her that it was already late, and at the Duke's castle they lent her a horse, telling her to ride it. She brought good news with her, declaring that she and her mother needed to move to the Duke's luxurious castle. Mother seemed unprepared to accept such help. She was sure they had nowhere to go and wanted to come up with something herself. The daughter carefully took her warm hands and told her that the Duke had given them an outbuilding for servants so that they could live there together. Tomorrow they will send a carriage so that Mother can travel in comfort and also transport all her things. She was incredibly grateful to Duke Vines, who turned out to be a true protector of all people in the West, who helped Marin without hesitation. The daughter hadn't seen her mother smile happily for a long time, and her mother couldn't even imagine how to repay the favor. The heroine didn't think that the day would come when they would finally leave the terrible hut and no longer depend on the impudent, rude mayor. This morning in the forest, the birds were chirping cheerful songs, but suddenly a terrible voice of a woman was heard asking her husband to go as quickly as possible. He trailed behind his impudent wife, who had decided today to quickly collect her accumulated debts. The man insisted that his wife knew their situation perfectly well and how she was going to get the rent paid in just one day. His fat wife screamed, "She's coming for the money," and is ready to tear out this girl's hair, but her mother's hair was not enough to calm her down. Jorge understood that no one would settle in such a hole, and if they left, they would hardly be able to find new residents for the dilapidated hut. His wife still thought that her hated husband had gotten involved with this girl, and that was why she was now trying to protect her. She screamed even louder, grabbing her husband by the collar, and was sure that this was a misunderstanding, and he was again covering for her. The fat man looked at his wife with frightened eyes, and he never dared to contradict her. To somehow get her off his back, he asked his wife to look the other way, seeing a young lady standing in front of the hut. It was no coincidence that Marin had come out and was waiting for their arrival, and they were sure that she would give them all the money right now. The rude wife said that she herself was preparing to have her hair pulled right now. The mayor and his wife approached the lady, who was like a fragile twig compared to their enormous fat bodies. The mayor's wife was sure that the lady had already prepared all the money, but for some reason, Marin today did not look like the pathetic girl she had been before. The lady threw a black bag of silver coins on the ground, which should have been enough to pay the rent. The mayor couldn't even believe where such a huge amount of money came from, and his wife was sure that there was only one way to get such a sum in just one night. She stated that it was obvious that the impudent girl had paid with her body, but Marin no longer took part in their stupid conversations. In order to finally take revenge on them and never see them again, she hit the rude woman with all her might, right in her face, like a piece of lard. She certainly didn't expect to be hit with such a sharp blow, and she was indignant, wondering if this girl had really gone completely crazy. After the blow, Marin angrily declared how dare the impudent woman raise her hand against her own mother, who had been ill for a long time. Now it was finally her turn to deal with her no-good man, and Marin also hit him in the face with all her strength. He had always been her main problem, and the lady asked if he really didn't know who he was cheating on his wife with, since he had kept silent all this time. Marin told him that he was cheating on her with that same Lady Windy, and this time the mayor was in trouble. This woman was the groom's wife, and the wife looked angrily at her husband. "I don't understand what this name has to do with it, because she herself said that he was cheating on her with Marin." She grabbed him by the hair after learning about her husband's infidelity, who had just called the groom's wife ideal. The mayor's anger naturally fell on Marin, since it was only thanks to her that his wife managed to find out the name of his real mistress. While his wife was pulling his hair and continuing to scream, the mayor wanted to get to the girl who was the cause of all this. But his hand was abruptly stopped by a man in a white glove, who declared that this did not at all look like a simple marital quarrel. The mayor and his wife were taken aback, realizing that the man standing before them was no commoner, given his intelligent appearance. It was the butler Sebastian who came out when he heard the loud screams to help Lady Marin. Now she finally felt that someone would really help her, and this happened only thanks to the Duke. What a luxurious snow-white carriage with golden patterns pulled up, and the butler warned that he had personally come to pick up the lady and her mother. Marin was surprised. They said they would send a carriage, but she didn't think that the butler Sebastian would arrive personally, and especially so early in the morning. The mayor and his wife couldn't even believe it. An incredibly expensive carriage stood in front of them, and it was all too solemn. Sebastian was here at the right time, as if he knew Lady Marin would need his help. The mayor's wife and her husband looked at the venerable gentleman in fear, not understanding what was happening here. Sebastian glared at them and declared that he had come at the perfect time to find out the whole truth, since Lady Marin was now safe. A cheeky grin appeared on the rude woman's face, and she declared that she now understood where all the money came from. The girl probably caught the rich old man, and she was sure that this was the only way she could pay. The butler stated that this was the property of the Duke of Vines, and this mountain also belonged to the house of the Duke of Vines, and he asked the mayor whether he had received permission from His Grace the Duke when he built this hut and then rented it out for a long time. The mayor, looking down, admitted that his lordship the Duke had said that a hut could be built for hunters to rest in, and he had allowed the space to be used for free, but had said nothing about renting it out. His wife started screaming how dare this man say anything to them, to threaten them, hiding behind the name of his lordship. And none of them could have expected that the venerable butler of the Duke of Vines' house was standing in front of them. The butler snapped his fingers and asked his assistants to immediately take away these insolent people who thought too much of themselves. The mayor's wife threw herself at his feet, confessing her guilt, asking for forgiveness, and even promising to ask Lady Marine. Now she was in a disadvantageous position. She needed to keep her home, but Marin, with malice in her eyes, did not want to help a man who should be punished for raising a hand to another. The mayor's wife screamed for the butler to show leniency, but it was too late. The butler asked Marin since when she knew that rent could not be collected here. The girls knew all about this from the very beginning, but all this time she regularly paid rent so that there was a roof over her head. It was impossible to find a cheaper place than this, so she did not want to complain, and she had to do so in order to at least somehow live with her mother and not on the street. Despite the fact that she had been paying a substantial amount of money every month, Marin was no longer prepared to put up with it. She could not forgive them for touching her mother, and the mayor and his wife had already been taken away by the Duke's assistants. Soon the mother came out to greet the venerable master butler, and she bowed politely. He was surprised by her manner of bowing. The assistant was probably right, and these ladies did not look like commoners at all. Sebastian assumed that this meant that both his lordship and the Duke could not help but know about Miss Marin's lie, but he still kept her close, and it would be necessary to observe why she was doing this. The only thing they had left was an antique coffee table, and that was the only thing of value. Marin asked her mother to get into the carriage, and she herself decided to follow on the horse she had taken the previous evening and promised to be careful. The butler had already heard about the horse from the assistant, and Marin asked him to take care of her mother during the trip. Marin was sure that the butler would not ignore her beloved mother, and now they would finally begin a different life. No strings attached, no horrible evil people who have been plaguing their existence for so long. Standing next to the dilapidated hut, Marin realized that she would never return here again, and this chapter in her life was over. Oliver greeted them with his radiant smile, showing Marin the new room. He was sure that she would definitely like it. This was the room that received the best sunlight, and it was a special room that the Duke had set aside for Marine and her mother. Mother couldn't even believe that this was really a servant's quarters, and it seemed that it wasn't like that at all. The entire third floor of the outbuilding was freed up especially for them. Oliver warned them that if they didn't like this room, they could easily choose any other. It was impossible not to like this room, and Mother admitted that, if possible, she would gladly stay and live here. Marin offered to live in the next room with her mother, and the ladies were so happy that they couldn't even believe it. At that moment, a red-haired maid named Yuria, who had been appointed as a personal servant from today, entered the room. Did they even provide a personal maid? The girl's red hair somehow seemed painfully familiar to the lady. The ladies met Yuria, and Marin politely introduced her mother, whose name was Rona. Smiling, the maid admitted that she was incredibly happy to help her new mistress, as well as her mother. Marin asked the maid not to add the word mistress, and really wanted them to communicate as good friends. Yuria smiled. She really wanted to serve her new mistress faithfully, and a pleasant, warm energy emanated from her. Even the maid admitted that the polite form simply stuck on her tongue. "I promise to cook delicious food soon." Yuria was simply a sweetheart, and Marin asked her to address her in any way she felt comfortable with, without formalities or unnecessary words. After preparing the food, the maid warned that if the lady needed anything, she could ring the bell next to the bed at any time, and she would come quickly. The daughter and her mother sat down at a luxurious table. The food looked delicious, and they had not felt so happy for a long time. Suddenly, a look of concern appeared on the mother's face, and the daughter could not help but notice it. She asked what had happened, and indeed, there was something that was still bothering her greatly about her new life. She was so taken with how well the Duke was treating them that she completely forgot what kind of person he really was, and that if they were discovered to have lied, terrible trouble could happen. Mother was right. If the deception was revealed, they would become like the mayor and his rude wife. All this endless kindness will end in a flash, and at any moment she could become useless as an assistant to an assistant, finding herself back on the street. Maren asked her mother not to worry, promising to do everything possible to be useful to his lordship. The Duke had already received information that the mayor's wife had treated Mother Maren too rudely, and had allowed him to raise his hand against her. All this happened very recently, and Gerald called the butler and Oliver to clear things up. In order to punish the offenders, he, without thinking twice, gave the order that all those responsible for this incident be punished as soon as possible. The butler was even surprised. Was it really necessary to do this right now, and why such urgency? Sebastian saw Gerald smile for the first time, and the master ordered the property to be seized and 5 years of hard labor to be given, as well as a full investigation to be conducted, and everyone to be dealt with in the same way.
The woman who hit Maren did not know she was a noblewoman, so the Duke ordered that she be restricted to the use of her hands.
Now all the culprits really did face a terrible punishment, and they were unlikely to try to do anything similar again. The Duke was incredibly harsh towards such people, and he was also fair when it came to good people. He had to do this to avoid disorder in his duchy, and if evil people are given free rein, it is unknown what can be expected from them. As soon as he relaxed a little, the Duke seemed to explode. His head felt like it was about to burst, and even his groan became an arrow, exploding the ears, and he bit his lips to hold back the groans, and the taste of blood already made him sick. Lost in thought, the Duke realized that he couldn't even remember the last time he slept, and whether there was any point in holding on like this, and perhaps he could just die, and then, for sure, it would become easier. He thought about it every day, but now he clearly remembered Maren's words, who promised to help him fall asleep. Gerald didn't know if she could really put him to sleep, but it was something no one had been able to do before. A wild pain seemed to burst the blood vessels in his head, and he understood that the lady would have to do this before he went crazy. Today, Maren found herself in a luxurious library for the first time, and she had no idea that there were so many books there. She was so delighted that she couldn't contain her joyful emotions and loudly exclaimed that it was simply amazing. The library was huge and luxurious, as expected from the Duchy of Vines, and her heart was pounding from the smell of cognac, which she hadn't smelled in so long. Now was not the time to lose one's head, and the lady needed to quickly choose a book for his lordship to read. Just think, if she helped him sleep, it would be a whole gold coin, and that was just great, because she could earn that much in a week. The library contained a variety of books, philosophy, history books, and even a book on herbology caught Maren's eye. In the original story, the main character cured the Duke's eyes by making a medicine using an herb called mandelsinn. The novel only mentioned the name, without any detailed description or explanation, or restyling. I wonder what this magical herb is. While reading the table of contents, she looked for the name of the herb mandelsinn, and didn't even notice how she named it out loud. She was so busy searching that she didn't notice someone entering the library and heard a voice wondering why the lady was looking for this particular herb. Turning around, she saw a new hero in front of her and immediately understood who was standing in front of her. The heroine looked in surprise at the little boy who approached her, asking what she was doing there. His incredibly blue sky eyes, snow-white blonde hair, and this little boy holding a book in his hands looked incredibly cute. The lady gave her name, and the baby admitted that this was the same girl he had already heard about from Mr. Oliver. This little boy's name was Zero. He politely extended his hand to the girl, and the heroine immediately understood who he was. In the future, he would become a cold-blooded and noble genius alchemist. He was the same age and the closest friend of the Duke. Maren couldn't understand where this angelic and charming appearance came from which it was simply impossible to contain one's affection. They said he could make a potion that would turn you into a baby, and maybe he drank it, but it was still incredibly cute. The lady politely shook the little boy's hand and admitted that she was incredibly glad to meet Mr. Zero. He gently touched her fingers and kissed her hand, as befits a noble, respectable gentleman of aristocratic blood. The lady was a little taken aback by the kiss on the hand, because the behavior of a small child did not look like a child's. Zero noted that Lady Marin seemed to be a very unusual person, and she was even surprised to hear such a confession from a little boy. Zero confessed. The lady addressed the child formally, and Marin could only answer, "She is a commoner, so it is natural for her to speak respectfully." The boy laughed, declaring that the lady could not lie at all, and this brought him incredible joy. Marin tried to prove that she really was a commoner and wasn't deceiving him at all, but Zero seemed to know who she was. Still, he wondered why she usually looked for the herb called mandelsson, and it was unlikely that an ordinary girl would be interested in such a question. The heroine asked why the boy considered this herb ordinary, since she knew that a magic potion was made from it. Zero said that this herb grows not only by the road, but also in the garden of the Duke's castle, and it could hardly be called a medicinal herb. It was for this reason that he did not include the plant in the book, and at that moment Marin realized that the boy was very familiar with the book. Or rather, he is its author, namely Mr. Zero, an incredible boy with sky-blue eyes. Zero even showed that his autograph was on the book, and Marin couldn't believe it, because it was simply incredible. Feeling superior, Zero was completely confident in his knowledge and was glad that his book was appreciated. Marin tried to collect her thoughts because this man was an adult and not a little boy. She decided to take an interest and find out about a plant called mandelsson, the only one who knew everything about it. He had another book in his hands, bound in red velvet, and the boy immediately agreed to answer all her questions. He opened the book to the right page, and indeed, there was a picture of that very plant in it. It looked exactly like the dandelion from the heroine's past life, with carved leaves and a yellow flower on a graceful stem. This is what mandelsson looked like. Marin asked if it was used as a medicine, but other than the fact that the flowers had a refreshing aroma, similar to mint, he was sure that it had no special properties. It seemed that no one except the main character knew about the true properties of this plant, and Marin was a little upset. Zero even admitted that it was not a medicinal herb at all, but most likely poisonous, and he was completely sure of it. This beautiful yellow flower contains toxic substances that only cause stomach pain. It is unlikely that this plant can be useful. That is why he included this plant in his special book, which he also wrote quite recently. Marin did not expect this turn of events at all, and it was radically different from the original storyline. The lady thought about it and couldn't understand why the medicinal plant was on the list of poisonous drugs. After meeting Zero, she thought about the plant for a long time. I couldn't understand where the clue was hidden. In the original novel, it was said that the Duke was given mandelsson juice to drink, and it instantly healed his eyes. Complete healing was the main character's role, but now Marin still wanted to interfere a little in the Duke's life, but not disrupt the plot. She just wanted to ease his suffering a little before their first meeting, using a very tiny dose. But using poison against the Duke is a completely different matter from simply lying. Apparently, only the main character was able to neutralize the poisonous plant and the creators of the medicine that will restore Gerald's sight. That's right, because the heroine decided from the very beginning not to interfere in the lives of the main characters. She only got a job in the Duke's castle out of necessity, and that's all. Still, she was haunted by the fact that Mr. Gerald suffered every day and experienced hellish pain that was incompatible with normal life. Marin learned all about his severe suffering, but she had to pretend that she knew absolutely nothing. Even if it wasn't her, everything would be fine, and she decided to just wait a little until the main character appeared. And it was she who had to save the suffering protagonist, and only she had the power to do it. That night, the lady came into the gentleman's office, inquiring whether it would be possible to postpone the wrist examination, and she felt that she was not yet ready. The Duke turned in her direction with interest, stating that she herself had promised to get better just a couple of days ago. He extended his hand to her and asked her to come closer, and the heroine no longer had a chance to refuse. His gesture was like that of someone extending a hand to a friendly little dog who is about to give his paw. Marin was not a trained dog, and Gerald only wanted to check on his wrist, which was supposed to be healing. Gerald even asked with a smile if she really wanted to be his dog, while Marin kept refusing. He found something amusing about it, checking that the lady's wrist was still as fragile as ever. She involuntarily pulled her hand away, warning that she was not ready yet, but that she would soon gain weight. Now she prepared to read the book she had brought and asked the gentleman to concentrate carefully on her voice. Marin brought fairy tales on purpose, thinking that this would help the gentleman fall asleep quickly, because hints really do make you fall asleep very quickly. Gerald said the more boring the book, the better the dream. It was good that she really chose fairy tales, and terrible if there was a happy ending. Having opened the first page, the lady prepared to begin reading and asked the Duke to exhale and try to relax. The sweet tale was about a noble crow who lived a long time ago, and a lady spoke every word in a gentle voice. One day, when a crow had built a nest in a beautiful tree and was living there, a snake living under the tree set its sights on the crow's nest. The Duke closed his eyes. Yesterday he had heard the same quiet, clear, pure voice that had given him goosebumps, but at the same time had truly calmed him down. Never before had the Duke heard anything like it. Her voice was soothing, and he felt his body begin to tremble. He found himself as if in another world, but his consciousness was still here, in this night darkness, under the whisper of her voice. Strange questions arose in Gerald's head about what the girl was apologizing for and what she had done to apologize, hiding her identity. He felt his consciousness becoming clouded. He could no longer think and asked the lady to stop suddenly, and from fright she almost dropped the book. Suddenly, Gerald grabbed her by the shoulders. It was strange, but for some reason people didn't feel any fear at all. He leaned against her neck, so unexpectedly that she didn't even have time to understand anything, and it was clear that this woman had definitely done something to him. When Maren finally realized that the Duke was too close, she screamed in surprise, and Gerald even wondered if she had used poison, otherwise he would not have fallen asleep so easily. He leaned against her neck, smelling the clean grass washed with dew, the dry sunlight, and this, which he felt for the first time, the sweet scent of flesh. The Duke admitted he had made a mistake, but his behavior was so incomprehensible that even Maren could not believe it. Having decided to ask directly why the Duke was behaving this way, she wanted to know the truth, and it turned out that he really had dozed off. The Duke confidently declared that she had just put him to sleep just by reading the book, without any poison, and he had not felt that for a long time. It was an incredible victory. Maren was delighted, and she managed to help the master turn off his consciousness, at least for a while. Gerald refused to read any further. Perhaps the book was not interesting, and the lady suggested that they run to the library right away to exchange it. She was sure that the Duke would agree, but for some reason he categorically refused to sleep even longer. In reality, he was simply afraid that he might fall asleep too deeply, as if he fell asleep, he would never wake up again. Maren understood his concerns and suggested continuing tomorrow, but the Duke even looked a little confused. This afternoon she was busily signing documents, and Oliver asked how difficult it was to help his lordship sleep. No one had ever managed to do this before, so he asked not to feel too much pressure. It really wasn't easy. Gerald dozed off a bit but then refused to sleep anymore, and Oliver didn't believe her words. He jumped up from his seat with joy, shook the lady's hand, and confessed that it was simply incredible, and only she had managed to make him doze off for at least a little while. She did what no one else had ever done, and Oliver called her simply an incredible girl. He was even ready to give her 1 gold coin, but Maren could not accept it, because the Duke was not completely asleep, and that was exactly what she wanted to achieve. Holding a gold coin in his hands, Oliver assured him that he fully deserved the reward, and from now on he was incredibly counting on it.
On the one hand, Maren felt awkward taking money for just a short nap, but she thanked the gentleman from the bottom of her heart, because tomorrow there would be another chance.
Until then, Maren had been confident, but a week later she was beside herself with the thought that the Duke was continuing to avoid her. Not understanding the reason, she tried to find an answer to the question of why the gentleman did not want to sleep and refused to see her. The lady finished the paperwork that was piling up like a mountain, chose many books to read to the Duke, and even had time left over to read books for herself. And today she stood again near the dark corridor, wanting to get to Gerald, who still refused to sleep. She declared to the entire corridor that sleep was a basic need, and how was the Duke going to live if his body was suffering and he was not sleeping? In fact, she really didn't want to say it, but she had no other choice at all. This was not the first day that she tried to prove it. She screamed outside his office, asking if he was really just afraid to sleep, and that he should admit his weaknesses already. The next day, Maren was walking in the corridor of the outbuilding of the Duke's castle, holding books. I don't know if they'll call her or if she'll be called again tomorrow. Suddenly she heard a voice, talking about how Mrs. Maren was an important person and that she was helping his lordship. She turned the corner and saw several maids, and Yuria was standing next to them, while the ladies assured her that her mistress was just an ordinary commoner. Yuria stood up for her mistress while the maids laughed at her, and none of them took her seriously. The maids laughed out loud, surrounding Yuri, assuring him that they knew the whole truth about Madame Marin. They called Maren an ordinary courtesan who came to sell her body, and it was unlikely that she would be able to help the master in any way. They also started talking about her mother, who had an arrogant expression on her face, and one would think that she was a real aristocrat. Yuria desperately tried to protect Maren and her mother, but 3 maids stood against her, grinning evilly and ready to attack at any moment. One of the maids waved her hand and screamed, "This orphan dared to raise her voice at her, and it looks like she needs to go through education again." While she stood with her hand raised high, ready to strike, a book flew at her and hit her right on the head. The enraged lady turned around to see who dared to throw the book at her, as a wave of pain rolled down her back. Lady Maren stood behind her and angrily asked who the maids had dared to raise their hands against. She asked Yuri to come to her immediately, and the worried maid understood that now everyone could quarrel. One of the maids grabbed Yuria by the hair, declaring that she would hardly be able to approach her mistress. Fortunately, Yuria managed to escape from her clutches. Maren blocked her with her body and asked the girl to stand behind her. The maid turned out to be afraid of nothing. She called Marine a courtesan who dared to put on airs, and since the Duke had caressed her, did she really mean anything? The maid was clearly not in a friendly mood, wanting to teach the newcomers a lesson, and Yuri begged Maren not to interfere, promising to sort things out herself. The brave heroine would not allow herself to be treated like this any longer. She furiously swung the thickest book, ready to throw it at the heads of the impudent maids. She hit one with the book and then another, while the maids, like dogs, rushed at her. Yuria also did not stand aside. She rushed to defend her mistress and tried to push the distraught girls. It all escalated into a fight. The maids fought with each other, and the angriest servant pulled Lady Maren's hair. So the rude woman who called Marinka a courtesan became even more angry as soon as she began to receive punishment for her crimes. She pounced on Maren, grabbed her hands and declared that it was useless to twitch and that it was better to just sit still. Yuria tried to approach her mistress, but the next moment she was pushed away by another maid. Maren understood that she was so pressed that she really couldn't do anything because one of the maids was sitting right on top of her, and she turned out to be incredibly strong. At the most opportune moment, the head maid appeared, angrily stating what all the noise was going on here. She saw a strange picture. One maid was sitting on the floor, all disheveled, and a third one was sitting on Lady Maren. The butler appeared nearby and was so surprised that he couldn't even believe his eyes. Maren turned around and greeted Sebastian politely. She was lying on the floor, her hair disheveled, but still polite. He threw all the maids aside with one hand, and the first thing he did was ask Lady Maren to get up from the floor as quickly as possible. The head maid asked Yuria what had happened here and why they had caused such a terrible commotion. Yuria said that they called Mrs. Maren and her mother courtesans, and she simply could not help but intervene. Everyone was sure that the maids were obliged to behave quietly, and the butler looked at everything that was happening in bewilderment. The head maid understood that she would be the first to receive punishment, and she screamed loudly, "How dare ladies say such things? These ladies are the Duke's guests, and the maids have just dared to tarnish the honor of the Duke's house, and they will certainly have to cut off their dirty tongues for this." Now the maids finally stood silently, realizing what a horror they had caused here and what the consequences for them might be. Headmaid Page personally apologized to Miss Marine, taking the blame for failing to properly manage those mindless girls. Maren assured that if only she had been insulted, she might have forgiven them, but they had insulted her mother, and she would hardly be able to forgive that. Since these maids were so free-spirited, she would like them to work in a place where I would have to deal with people, like a dump. Maren asked for careful supervision to ensure that the abuse of young maids did not happen again, and this simply cannot be allowed in the ducal house. Tears appeared in Yuri's eyes. They had managed to defend their honor, and she really couldn't help but intervene. Ms. Page promised to make sure that this never happened again, and moreover the lady needed to apologize. It seems that now that the matter was almost settled, the butler suggested that Lady Marine first consult the attending physician. Oliver appeared, also curious about what had happened, and heard a strange loud noise. He saw Maren's disheveled hair, and it was incredibly awkward for her to appear in front of Mr. Oliver like that. The gentleman had no idea what had happened here, but he asked Miss Marine to follow him. Right now, Mr. Gerald is calling her into his office to urgently talk about something. It seemed like it was not the best time to meet the gentleman, and as soon as she entered, Gerald asked what had happened, smelling a faint scent of blood. Maren said that she simply spoke a little with the maids using body language, and Oliver reported that the maid insulted her, and a fight broke out. No one tried to hide the fact that the maids insulted Miss Marine, calling her the Duke's courtesan, but they also insulted her mother. The Duke, without hesitation, ordered Oliver to cut off the maids' tongues, and Marin was afraid that it was really necessary to go that far. She admitted that she had already punished them by forcing them to work at the dump, and asked for forgiveness for taking action without first consulting his lordship. The Duke merely asked if she had won again, but the word again sounded too strange. The heroine realized that he really knew about the time she hit the impudent mayor, but that was not something she did all the time. The Duke noted that this happened then during the move and now, and it looks like he brought a real bully to this castle. His words sounded quite sweet, and a slight smile even appeared on Mr. Gerald's face, which always remained stern. He asked, "The lady must have looked quite something, and even despite his blindness, he felt everything." The gentleman approached the girl and, taking her hand, asked what she relied on to be so brave and desperate. Marin looked away and couldn't even find what to answer, because every time she felt very strange, and her heart was beating hard. Gerald ordered Oliver to provide the lady with new clothes and asked him not to misunderstand the meaning of this gift. Only more questions appeared in Marin's head, and she did not understand what kind of misunderstanding he was referring to now. He asked Oliver to go about his business, and the young man obediently listened to the will of his master. The first time, Marin wanted Oliver to take her with him, but suddenly Gerald asked what she was doing. "Isn't she going to work? And it seems like she brought some book with her again today." Holding it tightly in her hands, she asked if she could already begin reading, which she had been putting off for a long time. Suddenly the Duke, crossing his arms, declared that she could begin reading, and that he was not a coward at all. Marin didn't expect such a set, because all the previous days he categorically refused to even let her near the office. And did he really decide to go to bed now? And didn't even warn her about it. Just yesterday she had screamed in the hallway that he was afraid to sleep, and Gerald had definitely heard her words, although all she had received in response was silence. In fact, she didn't think it would be audible even in the office, and everything indicated that the gentleman heard her every word while she angrily ran down the corridor. Smiling, the Duke suggested that she begin reading and check how things would be handled this time. The Sarin Desert, located between the Oman Empire and the Sanders Empire, was the ancient home of thousands of species of bloodthirsty monsters. It was the duty of the Duke's House of Vines to contain the monsters that were pouring out of this desert into the Oman Empire to ensure the safety of all the people. It was a long time ago. The battle with the monsters was finally over, and all that was left was to return home, but some problems arose here. None of the scouts sent out to search ever returned, so the Duke knew they could move no further until they found the missing. There was still no news from Henders, and it turned out that the Lord and all his knights were caught in some unknown trap. They waited for some time, and finally some of the knights from the squad managed to find out the reason, and after a moment, all the scouts. The knight did not explain everything in words, and asked Mr. Gerald to see for himself what had happened to all the knights. The knights in armor stood before the monstrous flowers, fly traps of ominous beauty, which beckoned and confused their minds. One knight, the youngest of the company, wavered, curiosity, an ancient and powerful instinct, overcoming the caution instilled in him by years of training. He extended his steel-gloved hand, guided by an invisible force, and when his finger touched the velvety surface of the flower, the silence in the dense forest exploded with a monstrous roar. From the core of the bud burst a huge, bristling maw full of slime and decay. Gerald had originally ordered them not to act recklessly, so the knights returned as soon as they discovered this. The scent emanating from the flowers was incredibly sweet. It even stung the nose, and it was this ominous plant that intoxicated people. Gerald ordered everyone to immediately hold their noses, not inhale any air, and immediately retreat back to avoid falling into the clutches of the sinister monsters. This hellish flower had an effect on the charm. Gerald ordered the soldiers to be taken away and wait as far away from here as possible, but there were too many monsters to handle alone. It is unlikely that anyone can fight with one hand while holding their nose, and only the Duke, who promised to return soon, was able to do this. He assumed that where the flower's owner was located, there should be a center, and judging by the way they grow, they don't obviously protect it. Therefore, the Duke had to strike the sword into the very center of the flower so that all the other individuals would also die. Gathering all his will into a fist, Duke Gerald raised his sword above his head and thrust it into the very heart of the flower. A terrible scream rang out, piercing the silence of the forest. The flower shuddered in agony, the lifeless light dimmed, and the petals began to crumble, turning to dust. For a moment, there was a flash before his eyes as if lightning had struck, but even when he opened his eyes, the Duke realized he was still in darkness, and that was the very day he went blind. This time the gentleman managed to fall asleep again, and when he opened his eyes, he didn't even realize how much time had passed since Marin was here. Next to him sat Mr. K. He said that the Duke slept for about an hour, and all this time he was nearby. The dream was truly wonderful, 1 hour of sleep, and the body was already filled with energy. Freshness appeared in thoughts, and Marin was a strange, amazing woman, dangerous, who could either relieve pain or lock you in it forever. And now the gentleman was even less sure what to do with her next, and this was the first person in his life about whom he could speak in this way. Marin still looked disheveled from the fight, and she knew she needed to change as soon as possible. She looked simply awful, and it was no wonder that Oliver was so surprised when he saw her. Yuri's maid knocked on the door of the room, deciding to inquire if everything was all right with her mistress. The lady said that his lordship didn't even scold her, so there was no need to worry, and everything was fine with Yuri too. Unfortunately, this had happened to her many times before, so the lady was accustomed to bullying and ridicule from other maids. In a gentle voice, Marin called the maid by name and carefully took her hand so that she felt warmth and support. She asked him to never tell her again, that this was normal, and if anyone offended her again, she could contact them, and Marin was ready to fight together. Yuria was incredibly grateful to her, both for her tender words and for the fact that she stood up for her. For Marin, gratitude was not so important, and she could not tolerate not only the fact that she was offended, but also the insults directed at her mother. Yuri even asked to address her informally from now on, as this incident had clearly brought them closer together. Even despite the age difference, the maid admitted that she would really like to communicate in a friendly manner. When Yuria looked at her like that, Marin could not refuse her, and the face of this sweet girl was very radiant. Yuria offered to pick out clothes for the lady, and she asked what meaning there was in a gift of clothes. But it wasn't exactly a gift. The conversation turned to mending, and instead of mending the clothes, they offered to buy her a new one. Yuria thought for a moment and replied that in the West, this really does have its own special meaning, and you could say that this person wants to possess you. Lovers often give each other a gift with exactly this meaning, and it means that this person wants to possess the other. Hearing this, Marin was in real shock and did not know how to react to the maid's words. Soon after this, Oliver asked the lady and her mother to come into the drawing room, but she had no idea why he was calling her. There was an elegantly dressed lady standing in the living room, and from her expensive dress it was clear that she was a real aristocrat. She greeted her politely, and Marin asked if she had probably come here for a reason. This girl's name was Idris Smil, a designer from the Gloria Atelier. The Duke commissioned her to make a dress for both of them, and she was the main character's personal designer. The ladies bowed politely. They were glad to meet the famous lady, but the mother was completely excited. She couldn't even imagine why the Duke had decided to call in a designer to make a dress especially for them. Marin asked if her mother was entitled to a dress too, and the lady replied that His Excellency the Duke had ordered a dress for both of them. It was a noble act on Gerald's part. The Duke not only thought of Marin, but he also took care of a dress for her mother. The lady had no idea that he had such a caring side, for the Duke was known for his cold heart. Marin told her mother that last time she helped His Excellency the Duke, and probably as a sign of gratitude, he decided to give her a dress. Taking out a measuring tape, the designer warned that measurements must be taken first. Marin stood motionless, waiting for the designer to walk around her, touching the fabric with light, almost weightless movements. Idra, a seasoned professional, silently assessed Marin's proportions, her posture, the curve of her shoulders. Her gaze conveyed a mixture of artistic vision and mathematical precision, for it was not only measurements that determined the beauty of the future creation. Idra thought that the lady was a commoner, since she didn't give her last name and even looked like a noble lady. Besides, since they told her to prepare at least 100 dresses for her, that meant something. Looking at Marin, she wondered if this might turn into an order for a wedding dress, and it was not for nothing that she was asked to keep her mouth shut. In that case, she couldn't miss this chance, and if she sewed a dress for the future Duchess, word would spread about her fading atelier. The lady decided to prove it with her best outfit, and if there were plenty of clients and orders, her studio would eventually become rich. The measurements were taken, and the designer suggested that Marin look at the catalog to choose a suitable outfit. Her mother wanted a winter dress, so Idra recommended a high-necked design made of thick wool. Pastel colors are definitely a good fit for Miss Marine, so she recommended the second design in baby blue. She seemed to see the dress even before the first piece of fabric was cut. The catalog contained many new styles that could not be found anywhere in the West, and Mother Marin was amazed that there was not a single unattractive dress there. She even offered to take several, but Marin was sure that one comfortable dress would be enough for her and asked her to recommend something for her mother. The designer even noted that everything happened just as His Excellency the Duke said. Most likely, the ladies would choose only one dress each, and he said that if that happened, he was going to buy the entire collection of the studio for a huge amount of money. Marin decided to look through the catalog again carefully so that the Duke wouldn't buy every dress in a row if she couldn't choose. After the fitting, Marin's head was in complete disarray because her life was changing too quickly. Food, money, a home, she already got more than she deserved, and now the Duke was going to buy her a bunch of dresses. She felt a little uncomfortable because all she could do for him was read stories to help him sleep. While she was choosing a suitable book in the library, young Mr. Zero approached her and asked if something had happened to the lady. He noticed that she looked a little upset and depressed, and something had definitely happened here. The boy asked if she shouldn't be happy. They say she spent the whole day choosing a dress, and he even heard this from Mr. Oliver. For some reason, her face did not at all express the happiness that should certainly be present on the face of a lady who will soon have the most luxurious outfits. The lady confessed that she was worried that all she did was accept the favor of His Excellency the Duke, and for her it was too much. Zero had already managed to think that something had happened, and the Duke probably had more money than the Emperor, and it was unlikely that Marin should worry about this. Trade with the desert is a monopoly of the ducal family, and he must have really had a mountain of money. Marin hadn't thought about this before she knew the Duke was a fairly wealthy gentleman, but she hadn't even imagined to what extent. No matter how rich he was, she couldn't do that, and she decided she needed to somehow repay him for everything she had received in this short time. Marin asked the boy how much stomach pain the Mandelson poison causes, and the young gentleman explained that it depends on the person, and each organism is individual. Marin had heard that the plant was also used as a medicine, so she became curious if there was another plant that could help relieve stomach pain. The young gentleman admitted that he could not give such advice, and he was certainly not a doctor who could answer such questions. Marin thought he knew about all the plants in the world, and indeed, there was some truth to this. There is a medicine that stops stomach pain, but it is not intended for this purpose, and does Marin really need it? Zero agreed to bring it only because he saw in Marin a good and kind person who wanted to help the Duke. She still decided to do it, although she doubted it for a long time, but unfortunately she had no other choice. The Duke needed help until the main character arrived, and the lady decided to test how dangerous the poison of this plant was by trying this method. Early the next morning, she went to the Duke's garden and immediately found that same dandelion, fragrant and still very young. There were large flower buds growing here, and it was necessary to squeeze out the juice and collect as many as possible. She stayed in the garden for a long time, and did not even notice when it became late, and right now she needed to quickly go to his lordship. There was no time for cooking, so Marin decided to simply eat the flower to test its effects on herself. On that mysterious evening, she stood before the venerable gentleman again, and asked him to quietly close his eyes so that he could begin reading. Suddenly, Gerald sensed a strange smell coming from Marin, and his sense of smell was too sensitive. Gerald even smelled the scent of a chewed flower. It was truly incredible sensitivity, and Marin admitted that she ate some flowers. The Duke asked if Oliver was starving her, but he always took care of her, and the lady ate until she was full, admitting that she had simply tried the flower out of boredom. Gerald chuckled and said that he probably needed to try harder to keep the lady from getting such stupid thoughts into her head. Marin was ready to sink through the ground from embarrassment and decided to stop fantasizing. She began reading. It was a story about a mother who was widowed and lived with her kind and beautiful daughter. By a lucky chance, the kind mother met a handsome gentleman and soon fell in love with him. She hadn't even read one paragraph when she felt something strange in her stomach, and it was impossible to contain these sensations. Her stomach growled loudly throughout the office, and the Duke asked if it was really a fairy tale, and that its content didn't sound very appealing. Marin insisted that it was a really kind story, but her stomach began to rumble louder and louder. A burning pain pierced her entire body. The lady fell to her knees, realizing that the Duke always valued order and silence, and then this happened. Marin had no strength to restrain herself. She abruptly stopped reading and rushed to the exit, asking the Duke for forgiveness. The rumble in Marin's stomach made the Duke laugh out loud, the thunderous sound of his laughter echoing throughout the office, causing the torches on the walls to shake. All the ladies he had met so far were trying their best to look innocent, and Marin had just run to the toilet and would probably be embarrassed to even look him in the face tomorrow, even though the floral scent was very pleasant. She ran into the room. Marin was ashamed as she ran from she heard the Duke laughing joyfully, and now she would hardly be able to look at him. She had no idea that while reading she would run headlong to the toilet, and all because of this damn flower. Ready to burn with shame, Marin blamed herself for everything and cursed why she had to eat this flower this evening of all days. Yuria entered her mistress's room, asking how she was feeling after seeing her running to the toilet. The assistant gave her some medicine for her stomach and told Yuria to take care of Marin, and that's how she found out that she was feeling unwell. And now not only the Duke knew how she ran to the toilet, but also Mr. Oliver, and it was a double disaster. The heroine's body was in perfect order, but the same could not be said about her soul, and Yuria was even afraid that her mistress had a fever. But the temperature was not her main problem now she was ready to die of shame. Yuria saw a basket of dandelions and asked if she could use some of them. Marina now felt sick just from the sight of them. The maid carefully took one flower and asked Marin to wait a little, wanting to help her as soon as possible. To relieve the fever, Yuria placed a crushed flower on her head, and this was a proven method. The maid said she learned this as a child, and if you make a paste out of dandelion with water and apply it, the temperature quickly goes down. Surprisingly, the fever gradually subsided, and Yuria often did this as a child for her younger brother, who works as a knight's apprentice on the estate. Marin had no idea that the lady had a brother, and the title of knight sounded very cool. She was incredibly grateful that the maid took care of her and was incredibly helpful. The next second, the lady jumped up as if scalded with boiling water. Marin realized that the plant was listed in reference books of poisonous herbs. It caused stomach pain, and it was hardly possible to give dandelion to his lordship. Then you can simply apply it. Perhaps it will be effective, and there is a chance that Marin will be able to at least slightly ease his suffering. She thanked the maid for her attention, but Yuria was glad that she had managed to help her mistress. What can you do? Marin's condition really was too strange, and it was not for nothing that the assistant told me not to take my eyes off her for a second until tomorrow. The next day, the lady arrived at the gentleman's office, still feeling ashamed after yesterday's escape to the toilet. The Duke was even surprised that she had actually come, admitting that yesterday she had made him incredibly happy. Marin pretended that nothing had happened yesterday, and the Duke still continued to laugh at the situation. Today, before reading a fairy tale, the lady decided to ask him for one thing, and Gerald asked why he should fulfill her requests. The heroine asked him to trust her, but to do so she would have to touch the Duke, and she asked for his approval. Hearing this, a certain embarrassment appeared on Gerald's face, and he asked the lady to repeat it again. He must have thought how dare she touch him, being a commoner, and Marin wanted to explain before he misunderstood her even more. She assured him that this was not at all what he thought, but the Duke was already slowly approaching her. Gerald came too close to her and asked if she was warning him that she was going to attack him right now. Marin blushed like a ripe tomato and looked at the gentleman with surprised eyes. The majestic young man in a dark velvet robe smiled tenderly and was probably expecting an answer from her. At first, she didn't even understand what to answer him, and the Duke's question sounded too immodest. She insisted that she was in no way going to attack him, but she had just spoken of a light touch. On a small table lay a mortar with ground dandelions, and on a tray there was a white rag. Standing with his robe unbuttoned, the Duke asked what Marin wanted to start touching, and his pumped-up body was impossible not to notice. Marin tried not to look at his exposed part and wanted to touch it herself, but due to excitement she could not explain anything at all. Gerald wondered if she was a spy and wanted to touch him with a knife. Marin didn't expect him to say something like that. The Duke seemed to be mocking her. He smiled sweetly, and people tried to talk to him seriously. She brought with her an ointment made from crushed petals and heard that it was wonderful for relieving headaches. Gerald admitted that he was unlikely to need it, as he felt great today. Marin knew that the gentleman had a splitting headache every day from work. She wanted to relieve the tension and asked him to try, promising that if this method helps me, she will not bother him. Finally, the Duke agreed, and she was incredibly happy because today she really could leave with nothing. She carefully prepared all the ingredients and applied the crushed ointment to a cotton cloth to apply to her eyes. And she incredibly wanted to take off the blindfold, but she knew that the Duke would definitely get furious and would not allow this to happen. They say that to get rid of a headache, you need to cool the heat that has accumulated in the eyes, but the Duke was perplexed. Didn't folk tales say that this ointment should not be applied to healthy people? If they say it's useful, you can just sit quietly. And was Gerald really afraid that she had thought up some kind of trap because he called her a spy every time? Marin assured him, but in no way did she want to harm him. She just wanted to help him relieve a severe headache and eye strain. As trite as it may sound, even with this plant in front of his eyes, he remained incredibly beautiful. His masculine, majestic shoulders, thin lips, and sharp chin seemed to have been created outside the human world. While she had a cloth with ground plants lying before his eyes, he asked when he would regret it and finally take up the books, and Marin didn't even notice how she admired his face. She began reading again in a soothing, gentle voice, hoping that this time the plant would help the gentleman feel at least a little less terrible. While reading the stories aloud, she noticed that as soon as she reached the last line of the story, His Excellency would instantly fall asleep. That's probably why she was constantly looking for stories that were at least a little longer, so that he would continue to sleep while she was reading them, and not wake up literally after a few minutes. When she finished reading the story, she wondered if the gentleman was sleeping soundly today, and she needed to remove the bandage. She carefully approached him and carefully removed the cloth with plants from his face, but at that moment the Duke still woke up. He grabbed her hand abruptly and asked in surprise what it was, or rather what kind of herb she had applied to his eyes. Gerald was genuinely surprised and wanted to know the name of the herb that Marina had decided to try today. She didn't try to hide it. They were weeds from the Duke's garden, and it was the same thing she had eaten yesterday. Gerald guessed it right away by the smell, and his sense of smell was simply amazing, because he really was not mistaken. The Duke asked with interest what the weed was called, and whether it really helped him relieve his headache. Marin said it was a plant with a yellow flower, and its name was Mandelson, and this plant was located right in the Duke's garden. After losing his sight, the gentleman began to wear a bandage to protect his eyes from irritation, but with his eyes closed and open, any touch, even the lightest, burned him. However, today, for the first time, he did not feel the terrible burning sensation the grass slowly soaked into the bandage covering his eyes. It had been touching his eyelids for a long time, but the Duke did not feel any pain at all. It was the first time since losing his sight that he had experienced any pleasant sensations in his eyes, and indeed the irritation and headache slowly subsided. Having sent Marin to bed, he immediately called his assistant early in the morning, wanting to tell him what had happened. Zero entered the office with a disgruntled face and wearing a cute panda night mask, asking why the Duke had decided to wake him up so early without letting him get enough sleep. This charming young man with snow-white hair seemed to be that same boy, the alchemist Zero, his adult version. The assistant asked Zero to speak more quietly, but the young man was indignant the Duke had problems with his vision, not his hearing, and calling everyone together in the middle of the night was the main problem. He addressed the gentleman informally, and Zero said that if he didn't like something, he could fire him, and when he returned home, he too could receive the title of Duke. While they were engaged in a verbal altercation, Oliver stood calmly and wanted to know why Gerald had decided to call them. The young man said that Mr. Zero had not slept for 3 nights developing a new medicine for the master, and he dared to address him like that. And that's why Zero is so irritable now. He hasn't slept for a long time, and the young man rushed to Oliver, who all this time had to keep silent about his secret. Gerald noted his loyalty, but didn't show that he was surprised at how desperately Zero tried to help him. The alchemist admitted that he would like to make olive oil out of the Duke, and if he had any questions, it would be better to ask them quickly, but he was incredibly sleepy. Gerald decided to ask about the plant that Marin had applied to his eyes that evening. Zero said that recently many people have been interested in this weed, and it wasn't Marin who was interested in it, or by chance, because it was unlikely that anyone else would have asked about it. Gerald called her temporary, and even the alchemist was told that the Duke addressed her in exactly this way, and it really turned out to be true. A slight smirk appeared on the alchemist's face, and he asked if Gerald really liked this girl so much. How about giving her to him? For the Duke, this lady was not a thing, even though he still does not call her by name. Gerald stated that Zero was completely missing the point of what he was saying, as the boy stood there in bewilderment. And the next phrase struck the alchemist incredibly strongly, because the master admitted that the temporary had long belonged to him. The guy who never succumbed to the temptations of countless noble ladies now calls some girl his own. Oliver and the alchemist exchanged glances. This guy had never said anything like this before, and it was the first time they had heard such words from the gentleman. And that meant only one thing: things would definitely be interesting in the future, and Zero remembered that conversation. Soon he called Marin for a conversation. The gentleman warned her about an important matter, so she came without hesitation. He probably called her because of that plant called Mandelson, and maybe he wanted to ask her more about it. Judging by the fact that the Duke had remained silent even when she arrived, it seemed there shouldn't be any problems. By the way, perhaps because he sits in a lonely, dark room all the time, his skin has become much whiter than most other people's. Marin hoped that everything was fine with his health. He hardly sleeps and does not see sunlight, and this has a bad effect on his health. He admitted that the lady had done a lot for him during this time, so he decided to give her a reward and asked what she wanted to wish for. This was too sudden a development of events, for which even the heroine herself was not quite prepared, so she looked at the gentleman in surprise. His sudden proposal made her nervous, and she asked for some time to think. Gerald counted slowly to make the lady think faster, but the faster he counted, the more panicked she became. When he counted to 3, Marin cried out that she wanted to go for a walk, and the Duke even asked again whether she really wanted it, or if she had thought it wrong. The Duke jokingly said that they say dogs need to be walked once a day, and apologized for not having noticed this before, and at their first meeting he called Marin a little dog. The walk was like physical exercise. The lady thought it would be good for the Duke to take a walk. It was night now, and perhaps he would want to try to go outside at least for a short time. Gerald was surprised and asked if she really thought his body, as strong as steel, needed exercise. Marin just thought about his pale skin and how he always sat in his office, and she could have said she had simply misspoke. It was for this reason that the gentleman found the temporary one so interesting, because any other could have asked for money, jewelry, or dresses. Therefore, without hesitation, he admitted that he was ready to fulfill her wish right now, and even got up from the sofa to go outside. Turning his head in her direction, the gentleman quietly suggested that they take a walk on a mysterious night, but Marin didn't even say that she would like to go with him. Moonlight illuminated the ducal castle, and in front of it lay a field of dandelions, swaying in the light night breeze, illuminated by the cold glow of the moon. Marin was incredibly delighted, and she saw this incredible sight for the first time at night. She often came here for flowers, but only now did she realize how beautiful this place was. It was wonderful not only during the day, but also at night. The night air was cold, the lady was glad, the Duke clearly enjoyed the walk, and the fact that he leaned on her shoulder instead of a cane did not even cause discomfort to anyone. Walking at night was a new and pleasant experience for Gerald. Even the streetlights didn't bother him, and after using the plants, this advice didn't bother him at all. Suddenly he lowered his hand and moved forward, while Marin remained behind, and she even became a little scared, because it was dangerous for the Duke to walk alone. The moonlight, thrown over the earth like a silver blanket, did not penetrate his eyes. Raising his head to the sky, he inhaled the cool night air. Suddenly he began to untie the black bandage, something he had never done in front of Marin before. And so, before her appeared his blindness, not the ugly, disease-disfigured emptiness that she subconsciously expected to see. No, it was a snow-white, enchanting blindness, like 2 pieces of lunar ice frozen in his eye sockets. Marin looked, enchanted, unable to look away. This was a different kind of beauty, not earthly, otherworldly. Snow-white and silver eyes, like the eyes of a fairy born from white snow. There was no darkness in them, only a dazzling light. Marin looked at him, and the Duke, holding a black bandage in his hands, asked if she was really afraid to see him like this. He came closer to her and asked her next question, whether she felt disgust when she saw his true form. Gerald was sure he looked like a real monster. She felt a shudder run through her whole body, a wave of warmth spreading in her chest. If this is not so, why did she retreat then? But the lady admitted that his eyes were insanely beautiful. Gerald didn't expect to hear a compliment, and he was sure that Marin would run away in horror from what she saw. The heroine's face lit up with genuine happiness, and she admitted that she was surprised by his unearthly beauty. He came even closer to her, ran his hand over her cheek, and whispered that he was incredibly sorry about only one thing. He wanted to see her expression, but unfortunately it was impossible, and he could only feel what she was feeling. After we had bread, the color of his eyes changed from black to silver, and silver was the color of Monster's eyes, which made him wonder hundreds of times whether he had become a terrible monster. That's why he had kept the color of his eyes hidden until now, and Maren was the first person to see the stunning beauty in him. Mr. Oliver's voice was heard nearby. He was somewhere nearby and loudly knocked down the Duke. Gerald asked what all the fuss was about and why the assistant was so agitated. Oliver had a letter in his hands, he admitted. It had just arrived, and it was a very important message. The letter with the red seal was special. It said that the Count's wife had recently died. Maren held her breath. She knew who this girl was to Gerald, and unfortunately they were close relatives. She was his sister, and at that moment the Duke felt as if a knife had pierced him inside, in the very depths of his heart. His dark-haired sister was a mischievous girl with jet-black hair who constantly called her brother baby as a child. At that time, the young master did not like that his sister addressed him as a little child, and he really wanted to grow up as soon as possible. Gerald was short, and his sister often made fun of him because he didn't even reach her waist, which is why she called him baby. The young gentleman frowned and promised every time that he would no longer play with his little sister, even when she offered him candy. She knew the young gentleman's character very well, and she was sure that he would not regret looking at something that she brought him this time. It was a huge candy, similar to a fluffy cloud, or rather pink cotton candy, which the sister plucked from the sky especially for her brother. The girl laughed because she was ready to do anything for her little brother, even get real stars from the sky. Extending her little finger, she asked him to promise that her brother would continue to play with her and would never be offended again. Their relationship was very close. The sister loved her brother incredibly when they were children, and they were always together. However, the day when Gerald had to keep the promise he made to his sister never came, and unfortunately, it turned into a real horror. This happened because the secret of blood manifested too early. Even a quiet sigh hit the ears, as if the eardrums were about to burst, and I didn't understand anything. Little Gerald just covered his ears with his hands and cried. The sister didn't understand why the parents didn't go to comfort Gerald when he was in so much pain, but unfortunately, they couldn't do it. The boy lay on the floor and cried bitterly from the unbearable ringing in his ears. He was in incredible pain, and his sister just wanted someone to come to him, hug him, and console him. The gentleman was only 5 years old when he first began to experience the torments of hell, and unfortunately, he had to cope alone. From that day on, he was locked in a huge tower and lived alone. Having learned from his father about the secret of blood, he devoted himself entirely to the practice of controlling the 5 senses. As a result, the time spent in complete solitude became much greater than the time the young master spent with his family. Gerald, who used to laugh a lot and be lively, suddenly became completely emotionless, cold, and lonely. One day, while thinking about loneliness, he heard a painfully familiar voice, giving him goosebumps, which affectionately called him baby. He couldn't help but recognize it, because throughout his childhood it was this voice that supported him in difficult times and was always there. It was his grown-up sister, who now knew everything about the family's secret, and also about her younger brother's condition. She also knew very well that the young master could hear her voice even from afar, and there was absolutely no need to approach him. My sister told me that her father had gone too far. He had married her off for food, allowing her to see her brother, and she wanted to tell him about her husband, handsome and kind, with whom she had decided to spend her whole life. The sister promised to live well and asked Gerald that as soon as he managed to get out of the huge tower, she was really looking forward to seeing him in the south. Just like in childhood, she extended her little finger and was sure that the baby would definitely understand and feel her. She really wanted to see how he grew up, to at least catch a glimpse of her beloved brother, but unfortunately she couldn't even hug him, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Gerald heard her every word and decided that his sister must know. He could hear her even from afar. By throwing a large stone through the window, tied with a white rag, this was the only way he could congratulate his beloved sister. The sound of breaking glass resounded in the huge tower, and a note was attached to the white cloth. "Congratulations on your wedding, my beloved sister." The lady took the stone in her hands, and seeing the message, she burst into tears even louder. thanking her beloved brother. Gerald looked out the broken window and just prayed that his sister would now live well and happily with her new husband in her new life. This was their last meeting, their last fleeting conversation, and today, the black carriage of the venerable gentleman arrived at the huge palace. An assistant stood next to Gerald and asked the gentleman to take a special cane with a silver engraving. It was an unusual thing, Mr. Zero asked to take the cane, and the gentleman simply needed it today. At first, the Duke did not understand why the alchemist had asked to take this particular thing, and he had never traveled with such a thing before. As soon as he pulled back the handle with one finger, he immediately realized that the cane contained a very sharp blade, and more precisely, it was a weapon. He asked Oliver to hand over Zero. The alchemist had done a very good job, and seemed to know that the Duke would definitely need this item today. Marin ran up to the carriage with a suitcase and shouted that she would also like to go. She bowed low before the venerable gentleman, and he again called her temporary, as he had at their first meeting. Gerald heard from Oliver's assistant that the lady could not ride in a carriage and asked if she would be all right during the trip. Even if she can do it, it will be too difficult a transition for her condition, despite her strong desire. The gentleman knew how she felt, but he warned her not to overdo it and that he would be able to take care of himself. What Marin was most worried about was that the gentleman had hardly slept lately, and she just wanted to read him a book in the carriage so that he could rest. Leaning on a cane, dressed in black, Gerald promised to return soon and warned them that everything would definitely be fine. Marin handed him a small brown box and asked him to take it with him, and inside was the very same Mandelson herb. Without hesitation, the Duke accepted her gift and knew that he would definitely need it during the trip so that his headaches would not torment him. For some reason, Marin felt very nervous when she saw the carriage. She stopped again and was scared, but she tried to calm herself down. No one would get hurt. Gerald got into the carriage. It began to slowly drive away from the Duke's castle, and Marin followed him with her eyes. She only wished that the gentleman would be careful and return as soon as possible, worrying about him with all her heart. Gerald still didn't realize that his sister had actually died and that this was their last meeting. He looked towards Marin, nodded amiably, and she could still hear his words, how he promised to be careful and to definitely return. It is unlikely that this trip can be called happy. The luxurious black carriage has already set off. A loud slam of a fist on the table was heard in the office of one of the heroes as soon as the news arrived that the venerable Duke Gerald would be arriving soon. The young man was indignant. He specifically said not to come so as not to disturb his eyes, and it seemed that he was not at all pleased with this event. His charming wife with deep scarlet eyes approached him and asked her dear groom not to worry under any circumstances, because there was nothing he could do. He was already on his way. And since this is how it turned out, they will have to give him a lavish reception, and they must greet Gerald with special respect. At the Earl's house, Adrian had all the servants busy today before meeting the Duke, and everything was prepared to the highest standard. The butler Moro met the venerable gentleman, bowed low to him, and asked whether the Duke of Nourion had made such a long journey. A majestic Gerald appeared on the threshold, leaning on a black and silver cane, and next to him walked his assistant Oliver. Oliver reported that the Duke had written that he would arrive the day before the funeral, and asked where the Count's daughters and son were now. The Duke heard voices. They were talking about his arrival. Someone called him a blind fool, and probably not everyone was happy to see him here, but he clearly heard the unpleasant conversation taking place in the office. Together with his wife, a baron named Killen, the younger brother of Count Adrian, came down to greet the Duke and admitted that if he had had more time, he would not have held a formal reception on the day of his arrival. He introduced his charming bride, who was greatly honored to appear in person before His Excellency the Duke. The lady in the black velvet dress with red hair was named Gelmia Rose, and she had recently become the Baron's bride. Gerald didn't respond to her greeting, and Oliver stood completely silent, looking at the couple who came out. The gentleman immediately asked where his nephews were now, but for some reason the Baron began to get nervous from this question. He said in a false voice that it seemed like the blow was too strong for the kids, and they were still locked in their rooms, grief-stricken. Oliver was indignant. Since the Duke himself had honored them with his visit, they should have at least greeted him, but it turned out that the Baron had allegedly recently scolded them. Gerald never tolerated a lie. He could spot one a mile away, and he loudly struck the silver tip on the marble floor. Killen and his bride hardly expected the Duke to behave so harshly in the first minutes of their meeting. The young man stated why the Duke allowed himself such insolence, and now there is real mourning in this house. Gerald understood that something was wrong here and slowly began to get angry, asking how they dared, knowing that there was mourning here now, to start talking about some kind of greetings. He walked past the defense while he was trying to justify himself and ordered that his nephews be called immediately. The butler offered to accompany Mr. Gerald and first go to the living room. Killen was so angry that he couldn't stop shaking violently, baring his teeth like a beast, and this behavior was too much for him. The bride was indignant at how one could disregard the Baron so much just because he had such a title. The lady declared that even if his dear had been an earl, he would not have been so ignored, and she was sure that the Duke was behaving inappropriately. Of course, he embraced his beloved, and soon she was to become a countess, but it was only necessary to be patient in order to receive the high title. Jelmia gently placed her hand on her husband's back, not understanding that the Duke had no way of arriving before the funeral, but somehow he was here, and judging by his swiftness, it seemed that the gentleman valued his sister much more than she thought, and things were taking an interesting turn. The Baron strode furiously to his office, cursing Gerald, who had arrived on a completely different day than he had appointed. He hated him so much. His daughter-in-law from Vines was like a bone in his throat. She was always putting a spoke in his wheel, and his brother and sister were like a thorn in his side, the two of them, unbearable. He was sure that the Duke suspected something, so it was impossible to scold his nieces now, and approaching the door, tied with an iron chain and lock, he decided to first rein in the girls. There was almost no time left. He only had to hold out for 1 day for the Count's title to finally be in his hands. Having opened the huge lock, the Baron entered the room and quietly asked if all the children had been obedient while he was away. There was a tense atmosphere in the room. 2 ladies were sitting at the table, and judging by their expressions, they were afraid of this man. The eldest daughter of the Earl's house, Edrian, named Daya, looked menacingly at her finder and knew what to expect from him. The second daughter, named Garnet, sat next to the girl, who was shaking with fear at the sight of this man. He asked why no one had greeted him, since his uncle had come in and was demanding different attention. Garnet called this man a demon. He locked them here under a huge iron lock and hid the younger boy somewhere. There was not a drop of pity or sympathy in this man, and he turned to the lady with all his anger, asking why she dared to talk to him like that at all. Daya asked her sister not to interfere and was ready to resolve the issue herself so as not to see this man's anger. He said that today he was ready to let it all go, but promised that next time this would definitely not happen. The gentleman reported the arrival of Duke Vines, and Daya understood that only this man could become their salvation. She couldn't even believe her ears. Could the Duke really have come here? For many years he had been in a huge tower and had never gone anywhere. The Baron warned that before the Duke they must return to their previous good attitude towards each other, because once upon a time everything really was fine between them. Daya knew she would have to listen to his will, but in reality, it was all just one huge hypocrisy. Clenching her fragile fist tightly, she asked that if he kept his promise and showed her the boy named Ferrito tomorrow, then she would fulfill his request. Everything depended on how the ladies behaved in front of the Duke. The ladies had to watch their language and behave quietly so that he would not find out what was really going on here. He ordered everyone to dress up as beautifully as possible for dinner today and go down to greet the Duke and be nice and charming. Garnet screamed angrily, asking if her sister had gone crazy and why was she humiliating herself like that in front of this demon. Daya understood that this was the only chance, otherwise her uncle might not let them see Ferrito at all. Unfortunately, this was the cruel truth, and the little girl with green eyes asked her sister if they could really meet the young master. She promised to definitely see him, and the little girl really wanted this day to come as soon as possible. She asked her sister if His Grace the Duke could help them, and there was indeed some truth in her words. Garnet was outraged. The Duke never visited them, and she considered him a complete stranger. Even their uncle, with whom they were close, managed to betray them, and could a person who lived his whole life as a stranger really help them in any way? The little girl with sad eyes admitted that her mother always said that, but she believed that somewhere there was help for their family. Mr. Gerald Vines was actually here for the first time, and none of them knew what kind of person he was. Mother always said he was a real protector who could one day come and help them deal with bad people. It happened about 2 weeks ago. A cheerful boy with dark gray eyes and a happy face approached his little sister. Mom and Dad promised him a birthday present, and he wanted them and Daya to choose it together. This boy's name was Ferrito, and his mother was already waiting for him in the carriage to choose the best gift for his birthday. He promised his sister that he would return soon, and at that moment the family was incredibly happy to be with each other. She poked the boy in the nose with care and asked him not to be naughty, to be careful, and to behave very well. This was their last meeting. The bodies of the parents were found, but the boy Farito disappeared without a trace after the tragedy. Daya had to find her brother. She needed help, and first of all she turned to her father's vassals, but many only avoided her. She managed to find out the fate of some. Daya didn't understand why everything was happening so strangely, why her mother had gotten into a tragic accident, and she had only one option left: to turn to her uncle. Killen, seeing the lady, asked why she was so pale and whether she needed a doctor's help. Daya said that the vassals do not answer her questions, they avoid meeting, and no one is looking for her little brother, and she needs help. Everyone was silent. Daya seemed to be meddling in something that wasn't her business, and her uncle declared that now she had to understand why the vassals were avoiding her and whether nothing had really gotten through yet. He warned her that she needed to sit quietly until the funeral, and if she wanted to see her little brother Farid, who had disappeared without a trace. Only now did Daya realize that this terrible man had hidden the boy somewhere and probably didn't want him to tell all the details of the tragedy. Without thinking, he slapped her across the face, making it clear that she should not dare to behave like that again. Killen hissed angrily. The lady better watch her tongue, and asked her to immediately go up to the room with the younger one. And if she behaved quietly, perhaps he would bring little Farito to her, alive, safe, and sound. She had no choice but to become obedient, and then she might have to see her brother. To do this, she needs to listen to this man, not make noise, and sit in her room as he ordered. He locked them with an iron chain, closed a huge lock, and Daya missed her mother incredibly and remembered her with tears in her eyes. When Daya was still a child, she asked about her mother's brother and really wanted to know why he didn't visit them. Mother said that the Vines family had too many enemies, they were protecting their family and the baby, and even if he wanted to, he couldn't come. She always repeated that no matter what happened, the little girl must remember one thing: the Grand Duke's house would be saved, and this man would definitely protect them. She told the same story to her little sister, and they were sure that this man could help them. His Grace Duke Vines, who has not even responded to the letter sent all this time, how can he stand as a defender? Somewhere deep down, Daya really wanted him to help them, but on the other hand, she didn't believe at all how a stranger could protect their family. Gerald was incredibly eager to deal with Killen immediately, but he knew that the time was not yet right. His hidden assistant Kai had been tracking him for a long time, and soon he should have exposed him, and it was only necessary to wait a little. Oliver reported that the younger Viscount Killen was making good arrangements for the funeral tomorrow, and it was said that most of the southern aristocrats had not received the notice. That was not all, and from Oliver's gloomy face one could understand that there was still some terrible information. The body of the Count and Countess was so badly damaged that they were cremated immediately, but Gerald couldn't believe it. It was completely reckless, and the Duke found out that the Baron had only dared to desecrate the memory of his family, and he did not care at all. Meanwhile, at the Duke's castle, Vines Marine looked at the map. The Duke had covered the enormous distance in less than a week, and even at a fast pace the journey would have taken at least 10 days. She couldn't stop thinking about how the Duke was feeling now. He didn't like noise, and how he would put up with all this, and the dandelion tincture had probably already gone bad. The main problem was that the gentleman hadn't slept at all, and Marin still blamed herself for not going with him. She promised that he would get some sleep, but she couldn't even get into the carriage, feeling pathetic for the first time in a long time. While she was sad, a respectable gentleman with long white hair appeared in the library and asked why the lady had such a serious face. She saw this man here for the first time and looked at her new interlocutor with surprised eyes. The noble youth introduced himself as Zero's older brother, Jeromian Rodel Sant. Now the heroine understood who Mr. Zero was. He just said Sant, and it was that same northern ducal family. Why would the hereditary duke from the north be in the west? This information was not even in the original, and the young man asked if there was something on his face. The lady laughed and replied that the gentleman was so similar to Zero, and that was why she couldn't help but look at him all this time. Marin even forgot to introduce herself, and then she gave her name, and the gentleman really hoped for mutual cooperation. This youth was the spitting image of the young master, and this is exactly what little Master Zero would look like when he grew up. Jeromian knew his worth very well. He considered himself an incredibly attractive young man, or rather the most handsome in the empire. Even Marin saw such a charming, handsome man for the first time, bright and gentle at the same time. He was even a little confused by the compliments, but Marin was sincere in her words, and yet she still hadn't answered his question. The gentleman asked what she was so worried about and whether something had happened during the venerable gentleman's departure. Without hiding it, the lady said that all this time she had been thinking about the Duke, and thoughts about him simply did not leave her head all day. The young man noted that it seemed like this guy really did excite her too much, and even Marin herself somehow didn't suspect it. She denied it definitely couldn't be, and Jeremian saw how funny everything was developing between them, but her sincere feelings could not be hidden, just like the awkward blush that appeared on her face. The strongest and most reliable hero of the Empire, he would pass through all trials and find happiness, and Marin was sure there was no need to worry about him. No matter how hard she tried to pull herself together, Mr. Gerald would not leave her mind, and this became even more evident when he left. Standing in the stable, Marin carefully stroked the muzzle of the snow-white horse, which felt her warmth and care. The lady wondered how much she would have to hone her skills to reach the heights of Count Edrian, and whether she would ever be able to soar upwards with the same ease. The horse nuzzled her cheek with its nose, as if it sensed that Marin was worried about something. The lady laughed. The horse began to lick her face. It really comforted her, and it's not surprising animals feel when people are sad. The noble butler Sebas appeared in the stables, and as usual he looked luxurious in his elegant black jacket with a bow tie. She didn't expect to meet him here, and when she asked what brought the butler to the stables, he simply wanted to think about something in silence. Ever since he was a knight, he had often come here when anxiety tormented his soul, and today, out of old habit, he looked in here again. The butler's face was clouded with concern. Something must have happened, but Marin immediately understood his worries. Every day he carefully looked after the snow-white horse, and it was noticeable. The horse felt just great, and despite his advanced age, his coat was shiny and he was full of strength. This horse belonged to a young lady. He was the favorite animal of Countess Edrian, and it is evident how much care is taken of him in the Duke's house. The Countess loved horse riding, and she often begged her butler to teach her fencing skills. Due to his duties as deputy commander of the knightly order, the butler was constantly busy, and he had almost no time for lessons. The Countess must have been a very active person, and the man admitted that indeed, this girl was a real daredevil. The man's heart still ached terribly from everything that had happened, and Marin decided to let him be alone with his memories of the Countess. Sebas noticed her sad face and was ready to listen to Marin, who admitted that if she rode even a little better, she might be able to accompany the Duke on this trip. The butler was surprised that these were the thoughts that had been visiting her all this time, and that she was truly incredibly worried about him. Marin seemed to be in some kind of bewilderment, not understanding what use she could be, but she really wanted to help. After her words, the butler unexpectedly offered to teach her horse riding, and Marin immediately agreed with great pleasure. She was only afraid that she would take up too much of the gentleman's time, but he kindly replied that it would not be difficult for him. When the Countess asked, he regretted that he could not devote enough time to her and did not want to experience such regrets anymore. And it would be nice if Marin also learned fencing for self-defense and had an interest in it. It was never too late to learn, and the butler was confident that if Marin mastered this art, it might one day be of use to his lordship. It was simply wonderful to learn skills from a man who was once a knight, and the lady promised to study hard so that the butler would not regret his decision. He smiled sweetly and was glad that the lady had agreed, and that he would finally be able to fill the void that had appeared inside. A sumptuous table with a multitude of exquisite dishes was already set for dinner with the Duke. Daya understood that a feast during a time of mourning was a waste, but if it helped feed the younger ones, it should certainly be seen as a blessing. His Grace the Duke arrived for the meal, and everyone greeted the gentleman as he entered the dining room. The ladies stood up to greet each other, and as soon as Daya saw the Duke, she couldn't take her eyes off him. This man was incredibly similar to her mother, and they were like two peas in a pod. The same jet-black hair, snow-white skin, graceful, majestic gait that spoke of noble blood. Gerald approached Killen first, towering over him like a majestic mountain in front of a small bug. The Baron immediately stood up and pulled out his chair so that the Duke could sit down, and loudly asked the children to greet his Grace. Daya, for the first time, has little things to meet with the Duke, gave her name, the eldest daughter, Daya Edria. Next, the second daughter, Garnet, introduced herself and said the name of the baby, the third daughter, Rubiena. The Baron stated that since the Duke was sharing a meal with them today, he ordered the chef to do his best and offered the gentleman a taste of the delicious dishes. Gerald made no reply to his flattering words because he felt the man through and through. Oliver admitted that they said his lordship had no appetite today, but everyone else could begin their meal. The Baron was outraged by the gentleman's behavior, mentally calling him a blind cripple, and he was extremely unhappy about this. Little Rubiana was the first to exclaim. There were delicious dishes on the table, and Daya carefully watched to make sure the girl ate well. Because they had never seen such food before, and the Baron made it clear that they should act as if they were living happily here. When some had finished eating, Oliver asked the maid to clear the seats and prepare the chambers for the younger ones. The maid asked the girls and their little sister to go into the room, and one of the older daughters looked menacingly at the Baron. He was perplexed as to what was happening. Everything was not going according to his plan, and all the ladies had to be present with him. Daya looked at the Baron and only prayed that his deception would finally come to light, and this horror would end. The Baron remained at the table with the Duke. He began to get very angry and turned to the gentleman, asking what all this meant and why he had driven the girls away. Killen could hardly contain his anger and shouted, no matter how high Gerald's status was, he couldn't do this. With a deft movement of his hand, the Duke swung the blade inside his cane, and scarlet drops of blood flowed down the defense's cheek. Gerald spoke sharply. It had become very noisy in here, and he was definitely not ready to tolerate it any longer. The Baron was outraged. His Grace the Duke had just cut his face, and in the Empire there were laws that said it was forbidden to harm an aristocrat without reason. Oliver handed the Baron a snow-white handkerchief, asking him to wipe the blood from his face and to remain silent immediately. Killen had better calm down, and he could easily stop the bleeding with this handkerchief. The Baron snatched the handkerchief from the Duke's assistant, who smiled back at him, as he had absolutely no other choice at the moment. The Baron didn't even notice how he accepted the white handkerchief, and it was a definite gesture. And only in the next second did he realize that a white handkerchief was not accepted without reason, and this meant only one thing. Taking a sharp blade from his cane, the Duke confidently declared that if the Baron accepted the handkerchief, it meant he agreed to the duel. Gerald had long thought out this plan to punish the Baron for all his terrible actions, and was ready to deal with him as soon as possible. The ladies left the dining room, but Daya clearly heard the word duel, wondering what was going on there. She decided to see everything with her own eyes and asked her sister to take care of baby Ruby. Garnet understood her, but asked her to come back and be sure to tell everything that was currently happening between the Duke and the Baron. Oliver insisted that she come back, as it might not be the most pleasant sight for her tender eyes, but Daya begged to be allowed to stay. In a few months she would already be a grown lady, and she was ready to take on greater responsibility. And as the eldest daughter of Count Edrian, Daya herself wanted to see with her own eyes what was really going on in this mansion. The Baron shouted loudly. The Duke had deceived him, and the challenge to a duel was invalid. He saw the lady enter the dining room again, which meant that she definitely saw him not consenting to this duel. Daya declared loudly. She had seen with her own eyes how the Baron received a white handkerchief and heard the announcements of His Grace the Duke about the upcoming duel. Therefore, this is a legal procedure for challenging someone to a duel, and the Baron has no right to refuse it. Killen couldn't believe it was the girl who had sided with Mr. Gerald. As soon as he tried to shout at her, a thin, sharpened blade touched his chin. Gerald had warned him that during a duel he must not be distracted by anything, and the Baron understood the disadvantage he was currently in. The young man fell to his knees before him and declared that he had no idea what he had done wrong, but now he had decided to ask for forgiveness. He understood that he would hardly be able to compete with Lord Gerald, the shield of the Empire, and this duel would be a failure. The Duke uttered only one phrase, "How dare the Baron do such a thing?" although Killen was sure that only he knew the truth about the terrible tragedy. With great fear and horror in his eyes, he looked at Herzen and was even afraid to utter a word in response. The dirty Baron dared to touch Mr. Gerald's family while he tried to get out of it, claiming that the Duke had misunderstood everything. He tried to tell Dai that this was some kind of terrible misunderstanding, and that it was worth explaining what had happened. This was the only chance to finally punish the defense, and the girl asked the Doge with her whole body to tell the whole truth about Farido. She still didn't know where her brother was. She angrily grabbed the Baron by the collar and shouted that he should immediately hand over his brother, and he didn't care at all whether he died or not. The Baron replied with a trembling voice that he had no idea where her younger brother was. Allegedly, in fact, all this time he was also looking for little Farito, but the lady could not believe this incredible lie. He said before that Farito was with him, and that was the only reason she allowed them to be locked up and starved, so she could see her brother. And now he dares to talk nonsense about not knowing where he is, and it was hardly believable. For a long time she tolerated his terrible attitude towards herself and her sisters, and was ready to kill him right on the spot. She couldn't contain her anger, her pain was building up in her heart, and even Oliver asked the lady to calm down, but she didn't care. With a deft movement, the Baron pulled a knife from his pocket, grabbed the lady by the neck and ordered no one to move, and if she tried to attack him even once more, there would be trouble. Killen hardly knew what pity was, and warned that he was ready to kill this child if they did not follow his will. Gerald also did not know the fear of such vile people, and he asked if the Baron could really do this. The Baron was taken aback by the Duke's confidence and asked why he thought he couldn't kill her. The Duke slowly approached him, and the young man shouted again for no one in this room to move from their place. Killen was just a pathetic coward who could never go against the warlike Gerald, who was ready to do anything for his family. The sharpened blade flew past his ear, and locks of hair slowly fell to the floor. The blade was only a few centimeters from his face, and that was Gerald's first warning. Killen's eyes rolled back in fear, because just a second ago the Duke could have easily cut his face in half. His knees buckled, his eyelids grew heavy, and he collapsed onto the cold stone floor like a sack of grain. Gerald arrived not with courage, but with a sentence for treason, wanting to avenge the injustice. Looking at the collapsed Baron, the lady wondered if he was dead, but that was out of the question. She couldn't believe that justice had really triumphed after such a long time. Oliver declared that the Baron would be brought to trial in front of all the nobility, so that everyone would see the price of the audacity to raise a hand against a person from the ducal family. And he promised that now no one would harm the lady, nor her sisters and family. Dia began to cry with joy, and if it weren't for Duke Gerald, the Baron would have been able to do something terrible to them, just like he did to her family. Mother was right. She kept saying that one day a duke would come who would save her family. She believed all her life, even though she had never seen this man, but her mother could not deceive her. Lord Duke Gerald Vines really became the protector of her family, and everything turned out exactly as she said. The next day, Akai came to Gerald and reported that no trace of the people behind this could be found. It seems the Baron's bride had tied up all the loose ends before disappearing, and it was a well-thought-out plan. It turns out that it was the Duke who became variable, and he thought that the villain was using the Baron even more. Many secrets were finally revealed. Gerald learned the whole truth, and Mr. Oliver entered the office. The assistant brought Miss Dia because she decided to talk to Mr. Gerald in person. The lady bowed and thanked him for the favor that no one would ever forget, and now all that remained was to find her little brother. Suddenly, the Duke announced that he was ready to become the lady's guardian as soon as possible, and she did not expect this at all. There were clearly forces involved in this case that were far more powerful than they seemed at first glance, and the puppeteers had not yet been found, so she needed protection. The lady understood perfectly well what this all meant, and suggested that the Duke stay until they found little Farito. Through the open window came the cawing of a huge black raven, which landed on a tree branch near the mansion. The Duke asked if there was something like a spire, a high place for the birds to rest. Behind the mansion, in a small grove, there is an old bell tower of a temple, which the lady told about. But there was one nuance. She had no idea why the Duke had asked this, but Gerald merely replied, there was no time to explain now. He offered to immediately take the girl there with his assistant, and probably there he could find other answers. Once upon a time, his sister wrote a letter to the Duke, asking about his adult life and whether he still took offense when he was called a baby. She talked about the gentle southern sun, a peaceful corner that evil monsters avoid, and she so wanted to show her husband what her fencing training had taught her. A few days ago, she was walking alone and came across a place that resembled the tower where her brother lived throughout his childhood. The sister said that as soon as she walked inside, memories of her brother came flooding back, so she filled the place with his favorite toys. The lady wanted a place where she could miss her brother in silence, and she dreamed that one day she would be able to invite him to this secluded place. The sister always wanted her son to grow up as wonderful as Gerald, and one day the little one followed her, and she decided to show him this wonderful place. She wrote that the baby was incredibly similar to Gerald, and all children love secrets, but he was crazy about the idea of having a secret room. Since then, they were often together in this beautiful place, but much had changed, and now little Farito sat all alone in a dark room. The kid was sad that he hadn't stretched out the hidden treat, but now it was too late, and he had drunk the rainwater to the last drop. Farito didn't understand why he was here and where his beloved mother had gone. On that terrible night, his mother told him that he had to count to 500, and if she did not return, he needed to run to the secret room as quickly as possible and hide there. The little boy didn't understand why they couldn't go together, and his mother promised to simply drive away the evil uncle and ordered him not to go out under any circumstances, no matter who called him, even if it was his sisters. And if she doesn't come, if she's gone for too long, the baby must be a brave boy. Mother promised that one day the Duke of Vines would come. He had to wait for him, and his uncle would find him and would definitely protect him. Gerald knew perfectly well where the baby was, remembering the secret room, the door of which was locked. The heroes barely made it. The door was locked, and as they were climbing up here, Gerald heard louder and clearer how someone's little heart was beating. The lady was suddenly ordered to accompany Mr. Gerald, and she went with him. The Duke asked Oliver if he knew how to open the door without frightening the child even more. And at that moment, Daya couldn't believe her ears. Could it really be that young Master Farito had been there all this time? She started banging her fists on the door, and with tears in her eyes asked her little brother to at least answer something. And if he really was in this room, she asked him to say at least one word. There was absolute silence behind the door, because his mother had strictly forbidden her son to answer a voice, even if it was his sister. The lady seemed to have lost all hope, and it seemed her beloved brother was not here. If he had been here, he would have heard her voice and would certainly have answered her, which, unfortunately, did not happen. She had never seen Farito climb up this tower and ask the Duke why he was sure he was here. Gerald was absolutely sure that the baby was behind this room, and if he did not come out, even after hearing his sister's voice, there was a good reason for this.
The Duke heard his heavy breathing behind the door, and he knew downstairs that the boy was right here.
Trembling all over, Farito heard someone approach the door, and remembering his mother's words, he covered his mouth with his hands so that his crying would not be heard. He must have been afraid that his family was being held hostage, and he just couldn't bring himself to leave. Daya didn't understand. Her brother wasn't even 6 years old. How could he really think of such a thing? And Gerald said that his mother must have warned him in advance. The lady didn't understand whether they would have to knock down the door while Oliver was trying to calm her down, and the boy was already very scared. He needed to be given a little time. The child was most likely already exhausted to the limit, and it was impossible to frighten him even more. No one knew what the mother might say to her son, and only Gerald could understand his sister. If she really was trying to save him, and before she died she told the baby to run here and hide, there was only one option. The Duke called out his name and declared that whoever was inside had come to protect them. The baby heard the name of the Duke, which his mother pronounced on that fateful night, calling his brother a protector. The door quietly opened. The lady couldn't believe it, and indeed, the baby had been there all this time. Exhausted, with tired eyes, he quietly opened the door and went out to the people, hearing the voice of the Duke. He said his name again so that the little one would stop being afraid. The venerable Gerald von Vines. The hinges creaked like a sigh, releasing the smell of dust and oblivion, and with it the fragile hope that had been smoldering in the child's heart. Little Farito's eyes were filled with tears, hot and silent, and for the first time in all the time he had spent alone and afraid, he felt relief. He would be saved. The baby was so exhausted that he couldn't stand on his feet, and his sister immediately rushed to his aid, taking him by the shoulder. He took the exhausted boy in his arms, pressing him to his chest. Farito, like a small animal, trembled in fear. He buried his face in the soft fabric of the Duke's doublet and wept bitterly, allowing his tears to wash away the seal of grief and loneliness from his soul. The Duke merely quietly apologized for making the little one wait so long, while his sister stood nearby, shedding tears. She finally found her little brother, because her soul still glimmered with hope that he was alive and well. Gerald felt the child's body shake with sobs, and a determination was born in his heart to protect him, to be his support and his family. He remembered his sister's bright smile, promising to do his best to protect her children in her memory. At that moment, in the silence of the abandoned tower, an invisible connection arose between them, a connection of trust and hope for a bright future. Marin was not idle at the ducal mansion, and today she confidently came to her first fencing training session. She held the sword uncertainly in her hands, but she knew that she would definitely succeed under the butler's close guidance. Today he suggested that we start by practicing with a regular stick to understand and feel how to control the sword. These are the swords used by young fencers, and the butler made his own. An adult sword would seem a bit daunting to Miss Marine, and she certainly wasn't ready to pick up a weapon yet. Lady Marin's training routine began, and on the first day she trained with a training knight's sword, which turned out to be too heavy for her. After training for 2 days, instead of living, she lay and groaned from muscle pain, and on the third day she agreed to take a lighter wooden sword. Marin even regretted that the butler had taken on a talentless student worse than a child, but the man assured her that she would succeed. In fact, he had not met a student with such a spark for a long time. The lady's zeal inspired him, and his diligence was always rewarded. During the training, a servant suddenly ran in, loudly shouting urgent news to the butler. They said that His Grace the Duke would arrive soon, but everyone was sure that he would stay there for a long time. Holding the wooden sword in her hands and hearing the Duke's name, Marin was incredibly happy that Lord Gerald was already here. The Duke was already in his office, security was provided, and he had prepared capable and reliable knights so as not to worry about the safety of the young ladies and the young gentlemen. Lady Dia had a small request. She asked to be placed in a separate outbuilding and not to let anyone in there. The Duke was happy to ask Oliver to fulfill her wishes so that everyone would feel comfortable. Oliver understood that the girl's debut was just around the corner, and he was worried about her reluctance to interact with aristocrats outside of their home. He was afraid they wouldn't be able to find her a woman who would accompany an unmarried girl in public places. And if Gerald didn't want her to end up on the sidelines of high society, her debut couldn't be postponed. It was necessary to find such a lady, but she avoided meeting anyone in every possible way. On the one hand, it sounded like a dead end, and the Duke wondered if he had a bride, she would certainly be able to accompany him. To begin with, he suggested that Oliver make a list of candidates and report back as soon as everything was ready. He left the Duke's office and heard quiet, timid steps behind him. Upon learning of Gerald's arrival, Lady Marin could not sit quietly and wait for him to call her, and luckily saw Oliver in the corridor. He asked her what she was doing here at such a late hour, and the lady asked how the trip south had gone. The Duke heard the sweet voice and again called her by the stupid nickname Temporary, but Marin was still glad to see him again. Throwing aside all formalities, she opened the doors with joy and greeted His Grace the Duke. It was still a long way before evening, and Gerald asked her to come in, and he was probably also glad to see her. Marin simply wanted the gentleman to get some early rest, and it was unlikely that he would be able to sleep there, and out of a sincere desire, she prepared all the necessary ingredients for him. In addition to the verbena tincture, she brought something else to make his sleep more sound and deep, to help him recover quickly. Marin brought some warm wine with her and asked how about having 1 glass. Smiling, Gerald said, the lady, like a little puppy, was happy about her master's return, and had she really missed him so much during this time? Marin could hardly contain her strong emotions, and she told the truth, she wanted to see him. Marin told the gentleman to stop comparing her to a little puppy, and in fact she came on business to help him sleep. And could it be that he returned after such a long absence, and in response she still hears only ridicule? Hearing her voice, Mr. Gerald felt that he had finally returned home, and these were the first deep sensations. Marin stood opposite him, and she was incredibly pleased to hear such words after a long return, and she was just happy that he was here in perfect health, in his dark, gloomy office. She offered to apply the eye tincture she had used before and asked if he had managed to sleep on the trip. Suddenly the Duke took off his black satin bandage, and the lady even noticed some changes. His eyes seemed to be better even without the bandage, which is why he was able to remove it with such ease. Gerald admitted that he can now remove the blindfold for longer periods of time, and the light has become less irritating to him. Marin was very pleased that the treatment was helping her and suggested immediately applying the new mixture to her eyes. Apart from that night's walk, Gerald had never taken off the bandage before, and maybe the verbena and chamomile tincture really was helping him. And if that was the case, she was only too happy to help the master experience less and less pain. Today she prepared a fairy tale about the prince and the pauper and began reading it aloud in a velvety, gentle voice as soon as she applied the herbal bandage to her eyes. After his sister's death, Gerald was suffocated with grief for a long time. The image of her lying in a cold grave froze his heart. The familiar smell of books and the delicate aroma of verbena, The quiet voice of Lady Marin seemed to bring back long-forgotten warmth. He sat in his office, listening to a pleasant reading, with a blindfold on, and felt alive at that moment. Marin slowly read about the crown prince who disguised himself as a beggar and once told the knight, "I am the crown prince," and the knight only ridiculed him, and then the prince turned to an old man passing by and told the truth about himself. The old man called him a liar and threw a huge stone at him. The prince could only run, dodging the hail of stones. A life where true lies are intertwined, where the fake becomes the truth, and in this there is true meaning. The next morning, Mr. Gerald called Lady Marin to his office and said something she certainly didn't expect to hear. He proposed to her. Gerald gave her real name, Lady Marin Schwentz, a lady of noble birth, and his proposal of marriage sounded like a sudden chord in a new symphony, where despite the forced lie, he still trusted her.